I've ever had. It was a very hot afternoon during summer vacation, and I decided to have a lemonade stand down the street from my house. My friend and I rode our bikes 2 blocks away and set up shop. A few hours passed and she decided that she had to go home for dinner. It was starting to get a little dark out, and I was left to pack up the little table and the lemonade pitchers by myself. And then a man walked up to me. He was about 30-something years old and had a really strange expression on his face, like he was smiling and wide-eyed. He walked up very close to me and I'll never forget what he said.
"What would happen if you had no skin?"
I was taken aback and just responded, I'm not sure." And he said,
"What would happen if you had no heart?"
And then,
"What would happen if you had no toes? What would happen if you had no eyes?"
he kept getting closer and closer to me and still had something very, very off about it.
Is almost here, guys, and as always I'll be here bringing you guys scary stories and creepy countdowns and all that good stuff for next year. But before this video starts, I just wanted to throw something at you guys to consider. Something I've noticed is that many of the scary story channels and countdown channels, etc., they kind of sort of lack an individual character to them. And what I mean, you know why this is so we don't with similar ideas. I prefer if I shared my life. I guess, you know, if you want to get to know me there, that I know what you guys take. Whether you submitted stories, yeah, and it's incredible. Just 6 months old content. I'm so happy with all of you here. Videos, the community that I'm also for you so much for an incredible 2000. Yeah. So, just so you guys know, I'll be taking a few days off to be with family and friends over Christmas. It's really long. I help you guys to relax. I hope you guys enjoy them. The dreaded family vacation. You know, up to a certain age, there is a comfort, and excitement even, about being cooped up with your nearest and dearest. In my case, I made this realization worth seeing, and a whole lot more of them that just should have been left out of the Rand McNally Atlas. Here's a little background. The story that I'm about to tell you happened to me about 18 years ago. It actually is more of a story about my mother than me personally. My mother comes from a family of 5 siblings, and she was the youngest of them. They came from Germany and migrated into the Czech Republic, and they went willingly due to better work opportunities. As my mother was struggling at the time with the Czech language, and the gap between her and her siblings was large, she struggled in finding someone close enough to her in this desperate time. But she actually surprisingly found such a person in her oldest brother. They became best friends in the future too. I tell you this now as it has something to do with the investigation later. When my mother was about 30 and I was about 8 years old, she had received a message that my uncle, her oldest brother, he died. Obviously, she was devastated by this message. She would cry whole days and would be on the telephone trying to find out what had happened, as the police refused to tell her all the details. She would cry for whole days and was always on the phone trying to find out what had happened, as, strangely, the police refused to tell her all of the details. After about a week, the police, they came to tell us the cause of the death. He had supposedly been driving under the influence and too fast and had a deadly car accident. They also told us that these types of accidents were very common. My mum, though, she didn't believe this. My uncle was a good man and a solid businessman, and he didn't drink. Because my mother didn't believe the police, she called my uncle's wife to meet up with her. My auntie, she didn't want to talk about the accident, and told us that we should just let it go. But my mother was furious. She told my auntie that she couldn't believe that my auntie didn't care and that she didn't want to know the truth. After some conversation, my mother convinced her that she wanted to see the car. My mother and father drove one day into Prague, and when they returned, they looked happy. They told me that everything was okay, but I could clearly see something was bothering them. Later, when I was 23, my father told me what they saw, but at the time, I didn't understand. My father told me that the car was burned up.
I have a group of friends, and we've all known each other since kindergarten. There's 4 of us, me and 3 more guys. We're all 29 or 30 at the time of writing, steady relationships, either married or the modern equivalent. That is, except for the main subject in this story, who had just come out of a pretty messy divorce. This friend, Andy, had been having a really rough time of life, as his ex-wife decided to leave him right as his mother was dying of cancer. So it was understandable that we were all a bit worried about him. Well, one of my friends has a pretty nice country house that's far away from civilization, far enough to allow for a nice weekend retreat every once in a while. At the start of this story, we had one of those trips scheduled. The week before, as we were all planning the retreat, Andy decided he wasn't going to go because he didn't want to be the only one without a significant other for the entire weekend. We all insisted, but we kind of understood his feelings, and since he had another event lined up during that weekend, we left it alone. Still, I wasn't really satisfied with that, as I felt he could really use the change of scenery. So I decided to give him a call on Saturday morning, right before I left for the country house, offer him a ride, and give him one last chance to show up. I called him from the door of my house, and he sounded kind of weird on the phone, like he was sluggish or something. I even joked with him about it. It was kind of early, and I assumed I had just woken him up. He didn't laugh or anything, so I figured he was pissed. When I offered to pick him up and give him a ride, he simply replied, "Okay." I told him to pack up a change of clothes and meet me in front of his house. Then off we went. It was me, the wife, and him in the car for a nice 45-minute drive. I started noticing things were off just as he got into the car. He was acting really stupid. I have no other way to put it. He didn't get any of the jokes, had trouble understanding simple questions, and kept replying with either a simple yes or no, or with a really slurred, short phrase at the most. At this point, me and the wife had every reason to be worried about him. We started thinking maybe he'd fallen into some weird state of depression, or started doing drugs. He refused to acknowledge that anything was wrong with him, and so we simply drove on, hoping he'd maybe open up later on. So, we all arrived. There was food and drinks and video games. Yes, we get away from civilization to play video games, and since we'd all been friends for over 20 years, there was lots of fun to be had. It quickly became obvious to all of us that Andy wasn't acting right. He wasn't playing any games, wasn't talking at all, and spent most of the time just looking at us or outside. As time went on, I noticed he wasn't eating or drinking anything at all, and one of the guys swears that he kept tabs on Andy.
Sitting in front of my television watching a very, very strange show. It was a kids' show that lasted about 30 minutes and contained strange and sinister images. To this day, I believe it was a thinly veiled attempt on the part of the media to use scare tactics to keep children in place. Because the moral of every episode revolved around very uptight ideologies. Stuff like, bad kids stay up late. Bad kids have their hands under the covers when they sleep. And bad kids steal the food from the fridge at night. It was very weird, and in Arabic to top it off. I didn't understand much of it, but for the most part, the images were very graphic and comprehensive. The thing that stuck with me the most, however, was the closing scene. It remained much the same in every episode. The camera would zoom in on an old, rusted, closed door. As it got closer to the door, strange and sometimes even agonizing screams would become more audible. It was extremely frightening, especially for children's programming. Then, a message would appear on the screen in Arabic saying, "That's where bad kids go." Eventually, both the image and the sounds would fade out, and that would be the end of the episode.
G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. So before the episode begins, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Studio 71. At Castbox, you can find the best podcast. Just, hey guys. The Showers, Part 1, by Clover 10176. Every area and all parts of the world has those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts a lonely stretch of road outside of town, there is always a common thread within the tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen the creatures or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who will proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend or sister went to the haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and snakes and spiders, and is so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. Those same people will swear by these stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence, or a name of someone who could provide proof of the claims, simply because everyone around here knows that it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales on to their children, who modify them just enough to keep them up with the changing times. And the cycle continues. I'm as skeptical as anyone when it comes to these stories, seeing as I was like a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for terrifying stories about whatever area of the country I was living in at the time. I made up and spread stories about haunted pizza parlors in New York, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral, human-like demon creature in the woods of Colorado. I even broke the one rule with these stories by putting myself in them. This took guts, in hindsight, because I had to make sure that I always told the same story, the same way. Surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff, too. I like to think that I've had some wonderful contributions to various urban legends around the Midwest and Northeastern states. I moved around a lot. There was always a surge of joy whenever I would wander the halls at school and hear one of my classmates retelling my stories to another one of his friends, adding little bits here and there like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, that the stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground whenever someone asked me about them. I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking with a shaky voice or looking scared when I would recount a situation that I supposedly experienced myself. I suppose this aspect of my childhood has led to my current predicament, which I'll recount in full for all of you guys to take from it what you will. I have laid this little introduction out as a sort of disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who will call my story into question. I have been like the boy who cried wolf for years, but I assure you with every ounce of honesty and integrity that I have at this time, the wolf, it's real. From my introduction, it's probably apparent that I moved around the country quite a bit in my middle and high school years. Neither of my parents had anything to do with any branch of armed forces. They simply just didn't tend to hang around any given place for too long. I suppose that it had some sort of effect on me, but I wasn't hurt by it or anything of the sort. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily, was often the class clown, and because of that, was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time the next semester rolled around anyway. But my friendships were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships that I ever had with my teachers. Because of the events that followed, my memory of one teacher in particular is probably slightly skewed, but I'll attempt to give the least biased version of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of my social study teachers in the early years of my high school experience. But being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age, and I respect him to no ends for the way that he was able to connect with the students. He seemed like one of us. He talked like us, made pop cultural references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn while he was giving a passionate lecture about Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore, even a little bit, was the epitome of cool to a freshman in high school. My memories of Mr. Mays mostly stem from the way that he really got into anything that he was doing. The instance that is still very vivid in my mind was, of course, around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays had the typical teacher decorations around the classroom, smiling jack-o'-lanterns and black cat cartoons, typical and boring in the minds of egotistic high school students. However, on the 31st of October, when most other teachers were rolling their eyes at the fact that teenagers still took dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to a new level. We walked into the classroom and were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheets over the small windows, candles lighting the room, and a single frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting on a stool in front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk, just watching the students come into class and take their seats. He didn't even ask anyone to be quiet because the moment that everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them anymore. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood and took a seat on a chair, right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. "You know, today is probably my favorite day of the year, class," he said in a monotonous voice. "Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much." One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on her face. "I'm pushing the due date for your papers to next Thursday," said Mr. Mays, without bothering to look at the girl, who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted in quiet cheers, and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story immediately after the class had calmed down. I will attempt to recreate the amazing story that Mr. Mays told the class that day. The way in which he told this story rendered the horror junkies speechless, and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that had raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it, a look of horror on her face. The important thing to know was what the story was about. The specifics slip my mind now and aren't too relevant. I'll try to recount the parts of the story that matter the most, but don't hold me to it. Basically, Mr. Mays and his friends set out on a road trip around the country after graduating from college. They took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, and set out to sightsee for the entire summer. The group went from New Jersey down to the coast of Florida, New Orleans to California, and up to Washington. From there, they went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and then back to New York. This concept of freedom to travel anywhere had the entire class hooked in an instant. Mr. Mays was the coolest teacher ever, in my eyes too. Being adventurous college kids, the group didn't bring a map. There were no time constraints, so they just kind of drove in the general direction they wanted to go and eventually found a town to stay in or someplace that looked interesting. He told us that after spending a week in Colorado, he and his friends had to travel through miles and miles of corn, plains, and more corn. He assumed that they were either in Nebraska or Kansas when they decided to pull their extra cash and stay in a hotel for the night. They settled into a motel in some town that Mr. Mays could barely remember the name of when one of his friends realized that they were somewhere near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, they decided to get a quick refund from the motel and try to contact the friend's grandpa. They were unable to get a hold of the grandpa on the phone, so the group figured it would be fun to just show up. Mr. Mays' friend was adamant that his grandparents would take them in and feed them without a moment of hesitation. So the group set out with an hour of sunlight, seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in. In Kansas or Nebraska or wherever it may have been, there aren't a whole lot of natural markers that could guide lost travelers. Any directions given to someone who didn't live around the area basically amounted to go a couple of miles to the corn, take a right and go down a dirt road to the other corn. There should be some wheat on your right, etc., etc. So, as is the case in most scary stories, the group, they got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat though, they drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes until they found themselves on a wooded road that Mr. Mays' friend was certain that his grandparents lived off of. Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. I wasn't entirely sure how true this was because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanations of the trees that almost tried to grab the car and the red eyes of countless animals looking at them from the darkness. But regardless, the typical horror tropes worked on most of the class. Everyone was terrified at this time. So, the group of guys drove on this dark road for about 15 minutes before they came to a clearing and a small building with lights in it, and what seemed to be a silo. They figured that, at the very least, the people who lived here would be able to help them find where the guy's grandparents lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of the country fueled his hope. They pulled the car up near the building, realizing when they were out of the car that it appeared to be like one of the kind of places where one would store a whole bunch of chickens and not a home. But still, the lights were on, so they figured that they would give it a try. They approached the building as a group, looking in the semi-open sliding door to find a big empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime, and they couldn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of Mr. Mays' friends was convinced that he saw someone as they pulled up. So they decided to go inside and see if there was an office or something where someone might still be working. Why else would they have this huge place lit up like that, right? There were no doors on the inside of the building. Again, it was just a giant empty hall. So the group roamed around the property and over towards the silo.
What you want, baby? I got what you need. What's going on, guys? LogDadZip here. Was old. You throw it on the ground. It will linger for a while. You'll able to stay in it. Any mobs or human players, etc., that walk through this little cloud will get the effect. Now, again, this is a snapshot. Nothing appears to be said.
As they got closer, they noticed what appeared to be a cellar door. At this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the entire class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he hadn't seen many horror movies before that time, and didn't think twice about approaching a creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary foreign place. He said that approaching that door was one of his biggest regrets, in fact. Mr. Mays let the whole class know at this point that he was going to tell us as much as he deemed appropriate about the experience. He felt that we were mature enough to handle it, but advised anyone that was squeamish to leave the class early. Several students quietly gathered their things and walked out the door, a couple of them being stoners who saw this as an opportunity to smoke behind the school before their next class. I didn't even give the announcement a second thought though. Like I said, I was and am a sucker for this kind of stuff, and Mr. Mace was telling a story better than anything I had ever conjured up myself. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. After the class had thinned a bit, Mr. Mace continued with the story. He told the remaining few that he and his friends opened that cellar door, releasing a smell that he only described as the most putrid thing my senses have ever experienced. The group was no longer concerned with finding the owners of the property, but was now set on finding the source of that smell. They went down the steps into the cellar, which was lit by a single bulb spaced sporadically along the ceiling of a long hallway. No one spoke because things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, similar to the roofing on farms. The hallway itself was crooked and the ceilings constantly lowered and rose, like a tunnel that was hastily dug and then never touched up. There were sections where the boys had to almost crouch in order to pass, in fact. The worst part, Mr. Mace told us, was that the light bulbs continuously flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light and making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said that when you're that focused on something, or if you're that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It can just simply revolt, showing you things or people that aren't there. G'day mates. So, I just wanted to take a quick break before the second half of the story to thank all of you guys for listening to Be Scared. If you're a new listener, welcome to the Hive. And if you're a long-time fan, thanks for checking out the podcast. Huge help. Send the SA. Thanks again for tuning. He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat at this point. The hall. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Wait, Castbox is the best podcasting platform out there. And without I found my old copy of my favourite childhood movie, and something's seriously wrong with it. Part 1, by Dopamine. I was never into Disney. Don't get me wrong. I love animated films, and I appreciate The Lion King as much as anybody. But I always found Disney too straightforward, too simple. Instead, I love what my mum unfairly calls off-brand cartoon movies, particularly Don Bluth films. All Dogs Go to Heaven was my all-time favourite. Then there's The Land Before Time, A Troll in Central Park, The Secret of NIMH, and even Then, as ridiculous as this sounds out there, up on both iOS and Android, I think Castbox is the best podcast asking just how much variety they have and how user-friendly their app is. Anyway, A Shattered Life by M59 Gar. I don't know when you're going to listen to this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for a lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc, it leapt at me. There was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere that I'd never felt before. My hands and arms and legs and torso, they all seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding. But I knew that I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could tell that I was less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say that my life began that week, actually, because that was when I met Ma. She and I got along great, though, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched onto some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The colour of a neighbour's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. And 2 days later, at work, my co-worker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said that his name had always been Dan. I figured that I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Ma showed up that evening, but she had her own key. "Hey," I asked her with confusion, "how'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened a door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. The thing was, my mother had always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap, and instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine, and then I just went to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation. But I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature would consume pieces of one's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in-jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken away from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up, for 3 years. I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets, the time my favourite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me that the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I ever let myself zone out. But one day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season final of my favourite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. And right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, who are you? How did you get in here? He laughed and smiled brightly. Silly daddy. My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first years of his life. Ma and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I'd lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the flakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priests didn't even believe me and told me that I had health issues rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time that I ran out of options, I'd decided to just tell Ma. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly, I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But I still had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my own head. But the night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the settings on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord that I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for a second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, had broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple of months. When I found myself in a new place and time in life, I just shut up and listened, and making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Ma, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. And when I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special that she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go around, and I came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there, eventually. When we were moving boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said that she marveled at my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime and never once doubted that she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason that she'd considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her for my whole life, and I'd come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But, of course, I wouldn't be sharing this if it hadn't have gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed like I wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having only weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life, heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused and forever lost. Only an instant each time meant that I would never be able to speak with anyone else, and never be able to hold a conversation and never express or receive love even. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds, and I'd never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of times that I'd gone sledding or built snow forts as a child. A teenager touched my arm. Grandpa? He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. Who are you? He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel, and would you read it and tell me what you think?" Ah, of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He burned bright red. Well, trying to anyway. All right, run off. I'll read it now. The words were blurry and annoyed. I looked for glasses that I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read this book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Ma putted in and out of the living room. Still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time that I would actually have there. G'day mates. So, I just wanted to take a quick break before the second half of the story to thank all of you guys for listening to Be Scared. If you're a new listener, welcome to the Hive, and if you're a long-time fan, thanks for checking out the podcast. If you could please take a moment to do me a favour to rate and review the show, that would be a huge help. And if you have any stories that you would like to submit for future episodes, you can send them to my email at bish.buster@gmail.com. That's bish.busta@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and without further ado, here's the rest of the story. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple of kids that I didn't recognize tromped through the hallway, and I saw my son, and now an adult, walk by with his wife on the way out of the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story and I called out for my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. So, how was it? Well, it's terrible, I told him truthfully. But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people. But the structure of the story itself is very solid. I paused. I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story, though. He nodded. Yeah, so it's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal. Not hopeful like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that, I told him, and an idea occurred to me. Well, if you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures? Sure. I've read everything that I can. I love it. Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he actually took it well. You're actually serious? Yes, I am. He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. I'll look into it, see what I can find out, okay? But you should start writing down everything you experience, okay? Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound. Sounds like a plan. I was surprised, to say the least. That actually made sense, and I hadn't expected him to have a serious response like that. But how will I get all the notes in one place? Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them, he said, frowning with thought. Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life. Let's see if there's a pattern or anything. For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I actually felt hope again. Okay, well, how about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there. Yeah, good idea. He turned and left the living room. I peered after him and I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap!" But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cussing because of the shock. Did I write those? He looked at me with wonder. Yeah, or you will at least. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this. He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. So, you probably shouldn't see what they say then. That could get weird. That much I understood. Yeah, right. There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these is gonna take a really long time. His tone dropped to deadly serious. But I'll save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can. Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prisons of awareness until I finally met someone who understood. And then, just like that, I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, with those weeks becoming days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 30th, and my last box was the 1st. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew then that it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and just stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colours and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snowfall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. "Come on, I think I finally figured it out." I was so frail that moving was painful. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" "Yes." He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. "How long have you worked on this?" I asked him, aghast. "Tell me that you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine." His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. "It'll be worth it." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look, this shock, it's carefully calibrated, okay?" The electric zap from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulder. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging, leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear, and its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it is going to hurt really badly. Are you sure you're up for this?" Fearful, I asked, Is Ma here?" His face softened. No. Not for a few years now." I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. "How?" "We have this conversation a lot," he responded. Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel any better." Tears brimmed in my eyes. "Then I don't care if it hurts, or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive." He made a sympathetic noise of understanding, and then returned to his machine to hook several wires and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of Ubu, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness and reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. Obviously, I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head, in exact line with where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. What's Ubu? He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few stitches. You ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electroshock therapy. I could still see Ma smile, even though she was dead and I'd just been with her moments ago. Do it. The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything. At least, at first. But then, I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within that image convulsing. Oh no, it did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful, in fact. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6 clawed lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Ma's smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lining up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. And for the first time, I got to hold Ma's hand and be there with her. But then, that moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she laid in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. Why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room, and I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh shit. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before, but this time it hissed, and then turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson, he'd actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze, And while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Majori. Calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed, dying. It was all going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing that I would have left would be sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have all of my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone, and with a smile, I asked, hey, who's this? Even though I already knew. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Be Scared podcast. And please, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode too. Also, it would be much appreciated if you could share this new podcast with your friends and family and on social media too. Thanks again for listening, guys, and I'll see you mates. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. So before the episode begins, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Castbox for helping me make the Castbox original, Be Scared, which is produced along with Studio 71. Now, Castbox is the fastest growing, highest rated podcast app on both iOS and Android, and you can find all of your favorite podcasts there. Personally, I think Castbox is the best podcasting platform out there, and I hope you guys check it out because I think you'll be surprised at just how much variety they have and how user-friendly their app is. Anyway guys, thanks for listening, and without further ado, let's begin. Stuck by M59 Gar. When I first saw him standing out there on the sidewalk, I thought nothing of it. I certainly didn't think that he'd still be out there come September. I lingered at the window for just a moment, and I decided that the nightbound silhouette across the street was just some guy out for a walk, and went to my room and hit the hay. As I stood blearily over the coffee maker the next morning, my eyes strayed up to the window over the sink, and a little shock of adrenaline removed the need for caffeine. He was still there, and still standing on the opposite sidewalk, looking at my house. My roommates had all gone to work long ago, so I waited for my coffee, got dressed, and then approached the front door and peered through the peephole. He was still there. I took a deep breath, readied myself for whatever nonsense this was going to entail, and opened the door. His gaze shifted to me as soon as I stepped out onto the porch, and he watched me as I walked across the grass. He tensed when I stepped out onto the sidewalk, but then looked relieved when I crossed it and reached the curb. Stopping there, I kept the pavement between us. I didn't know exactly how to ask him what the hell he was doing. Hey, what's up? He looked a little bit nervous. Nothing. Just hanging out. From where I was standing, he didn't appear to be homeless or crazy or anything. He was a man of about 40 dressed in a dark blue robe, and I vaguely recognized him. Hey, don't you live in that house? I pointed up the driveway behind him. He nodded. Yep, that's mine. Just came out to get the newspaper. I glanced down at his hand where he held an orange bag with the newspaper rolled up inside it. Ah, well, looks like you got it. I paused. Another orange bag was laying further up the driveway, as if the one he was holding was actually yesterday's. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with a masked, nervous expression. "Hey, did I see you out here last night too?" I asked. Yeah, that was me." I looked down further and saw that his feet, they were bare. "You weren't out here all night, were you?" I expected him to laugh off the idea, but instead he replied, Yeah, I was." "You've been out here all night in bare feet?" Panic was oozing out from under his mask of calm politeness in a dozen different ways. Yeah." Now I was starting to feel more than a little weird. "Are you going to stand out here all day too?" He strained to speak, but then seemed to change his reply. "I might. It's beautiful weather out." Well, that much was true. It was a warm summer day, bright and beautiful. "Well, could you at least not stare at my house then?" He began to give an apologetic shrug, but stopped halfway through the motion and tried to turn. His bare feet, they never lifted from the sidewalk. The attempted turn was more of a twist from the thighs up. And that, too, stopped rather quickly. And then he said, His gaze moved in a circle before he finally looked directly at me. "Your house is nice, and I like looking at it." By then, I was getting rather annoyed. "What's your name?" It's Russ." "Russ, nice to meet you." I shook my head. I'd never had to do this before. "If you don't stop being weird and staring at our house, I'm going to call the police, okay?" His eyes lit up. "Yes, please do that." That was a weird enough reaction that I actually got my phone. I'd been raised to never involve the police for any reason, but this was abnormal enough that I felt I had to. I told the dispatcher that we had a strange man standing outside our house and that he'd been there literally all night. Yes, all night. She said that 2 officers would be with us shortly. Russ and I didn't talk much while waiting for them. He just stood there, looking at me at random times and around the neighborhood otherwise. Ours was a quiet street, populated by nice people who kept mostly to themselves. We'd never even had cause to really meet each other. If we had, I might have known more about Russ. But as things were, he was just some man acting really strangely. Although his aura of masked nervousness calmed as a squad car turned the lane and approached us. 2 uninformed officers climbed out and approached us with tired stances. One asked dismissively, "What seems to be the issue, gentlemen?" Russ looked to me, hopefully. I told them. Yeah, so this guy, he's been standing out here staring at our house all night long." The second cop rolled his eyes, but he did ask Russ, "Is that true, sir?" Russ gulped and stated, Yeah." Both cops straightened at the unexpected answer. The first one asked, "Seriously?" Russ nodded. The second cop looked at each of us for a moment and then said, "Well, move it along then." Russ tensed and stood a little taller. "No." "What?" I said no. As the pair began walking toward him, he added, "Sir?" As one of them got out handcuffs, the other sneered and said, "Listen, asshole." But he stopped about 2 feet from Russ. His partner froze as well. "Come on," Russ urged them. "What are you waiting for? Come on. The two men looked at each other with haunted expressions, and then began to back away. The handcuffs were returned to their belt. No! Russ shouted at them. Do it, you pricks! You pigs, you ugly bastards! Come on, beat me up! Teach me a lesson! Knock me down! The first cop's face was pale. You're fine, sir. You're absolutely right. We're pigs. Just do what you like. Stand there as long as you want. You're on your property, technically, so this is none of our business. The second glanced at me with apologetic terror, and both jumped in their car and just peeled away. Russ screamed incoherently after them, but didn't move from his spot on the sidewalk. I called the station a second time to ask what had happened, but after taking my address, the dispatcher told me to never call again and just hung up. The anger faded out of Russ as he saw me lower the phone, and I just stood there awkwardly as the grown man across the street began to outright cry. I'd never seen a 40-year-old man blubber from sheer hopeless terror. Russ, what's going on? He couldn't answer past his tears. Looking left and right first, I finally stepped onto the street and got near him. And I had the strangest notion, but I couldn't articulate it. The words simply wouldn't come to mind, and instinctual awareness was the most I could manage. I did reach the opposite curb right in front of him, and I was intent on pushing him back off his spot on the sidewalk, but I changed my mind about 2 feet away from him. It would have been weird to touch a crying grown man. I stepped back to the street. Confused, I tried a second time. At 2 feet away from him, literally within arm's reach, I changed my mind again. He could do what he liked. Who was I to interfere if he wanted to stand outside on a beautiful day, right? Each time I got close and then changed my mind, his tears and terror deepened. I remember murmuring, "All right, screw this," and I backed up to the middle of the street to get a space for a running start. I couldn't articulate what I was doing, but I guessed that a leaping tackle might actually work. I braced myself and then launched forward, ready to spring up at the proper distance. But as I went to jump to him, I changed my mind. There was nothing wrong, and I was being silly. Who cared about any of this? I slowed and curved away, and his sobbing became a river. Despite an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong, I turned and slowly went back inside. I could still see him through the kitchen window, and I began going about the business of my day with a muted horror that I could not acknowledge gnawing at my heart. Each time I looked, I would hope against hope that he had moved, but he was always still there, shaking, crying, and looking around for help. That was June. A pall hung over our neighborhood. Where once my roommates and I had held board game parties and had dozens of people over, now we ate meager meals in silence. Whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work, or perhaps an event that we were looking forward to, we would get out half a sentence and then be overwhelmed by a sense of hollowness. Who would care about a concert or a trip to a water park at a time like this? We would stop our sentence midway through and glance out the kitchen window as a group. Always, Russ was still standing there. He successfully avoided dangerous sunburns by lifting his robe over his head during the brightest hours, and he had a few nearby trees to shade him at other times. His bare feet took the worst of it, and were red and boiled over after a week. During that second week, we gathered daily as a neighbourhood. It was impossible not to have noticed him standing out there by then, and all the various residents of our street wandered out to speak to him and to one another about various polite topics with strained undertones. Terrible weather, a neighbour would say, her eyes fearful. The weather was gorgeous and beautiful too. Absolutely terrible weather, another of us would say. Horrifying, in fact. What the hell is happening with the weather? I remember the oldest of us, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and was normally tough as nails, then cried openly and sobbed.
Why is the weather doing this?
Russ stood through all of this, visibly hopeful and terrified. The old woman screamed at him.
Why don't you just go inside?
He could only shrug and shakily tell her, I don't want to go inside. I like sunburn on my feet. She approached him with both hands up to throttle him, but changed her mind as she came within reach. You're a man. You can take it. I shouldn't interrupt your enjoyment of nature. She hobbled away in tears, trembling violently. Another of our neighbours stepped forward. Well, at least take these clothes. He held a folded shirt and a pair of jeans forward, but turned away before getting close enough to hand them over. You probably don't want my old hand-me-downs, right? Right, Russ replied hopelessly. I'm fine. Thanks, though. It was the rainy season in our parts, and it began to drizzle on our heads, so we retreated to our homes to gaze out the window and watch Russ thirstily hold open his mouth to the sky. Once the torrent was heavy enough, he could also lean down and scoop water from the flow running along the curb. And that gave us an idea. G'day, mates. So, I just wanted to take a quick break before the second half of the story to thank all of you guys for listening to Be Scared. If you're a new listener, welcome to the Hive. And if you're a long-time fan, thanks for checking out the podcast. If you could please take a moment to do me a favour to rate and review the show, that would be a huge help. And if you have any stories that you would like to submit for future episodes, you can send them to my email at bish.buster@gmail.com. That's bish.busta@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and without further ado, here's the rest of the story. As a neighbourhood, we began to wash our cars more often. The runoff from the hoses would flow past Russ, allowing him to drink and stay alive, but only for as long as was normal for washing one's car. None of us mentioned it to one another. We just saw others doing it, so we did it too. The rainy season also brought worms up from out of the ground, which he ate, and he learned to stand still long enough for birds to come near. He would grab them and eat them whole. The sidewalk near him became foul with taste until each new rain washed it clean. One of the men on the street began building a long wood and metal contraption, and for the first time in a month, we had something else to see outside our windows, and we watched him for nearly a week before getting a sense of what he was doing. It was a massively long Rube Goldberg machine full of levers, swinging hammers, rolling balls, and all other assorted nonsense. From the 2x4s that he'd laid out, he'd planned for it to extend all the way down the street, around the corner, and out of sight. My roommates and I took a few days off work and wordlessly began helping. The older woman in the neighbourhood brought out drinks and food for us. Russ looked on while we ate and drank, but he watched especially carefully while we worked. I'd never been one for tools, but I muddled through, figuring out how to saw and nail things effectively, and the other men in the neighborhood joined us without a word when they saw how serious we were. It took 6 days, but we finally finished the contraption on the eve of a big storm. As the sky was growing dark, we gathered around the corner out of sight of Russ and stared at the button that would activate the machine. If all the levers and hammers and contraptions worked, Russ would be knocked over by a battering ram mechanism at the very end. We stared at the button, and a jogger approached, and we stared at her. She slowed and looked worried that 30-odd people were watching her. We backed up and glanced at the button repeatedly. "Do you want me to push this?" she asked, cautious but concerned. "Is this some sort of prank video?" We looked at each other, and the old woman, who had survived the Great Depression, shrugged and nodded. The jogger moved close and hovered her hand over the button, before backing up. Nah, I'd rather not participate in a prank video, thanks." Her expression was fearful and pained. She jogged on as we stood in despair. The storm came and destroyed most of the mechanisms. The man who started it took it down in grief-stricken silence over the course of the next week. Russ watched that process with despondent eyes. A moving truck pulled up one morning, and we gathered on the street to watch his wife begin packing things. "Well, Russ lost his job because he stopped showing up," she explained. "And now we can't afford the place anymore." She looked over at him with narrowed eyes and said hatefully, "I don't understand why he's doing this, but I'm not staying with an unemployed loser who would rather stand around all day than do some honest work. This is honest work," he called over, crying despite his words. "It's tough standing here without rest. I do get tired, but someone has to do it." We watched her put Russ's son in the passenger seat and then drive off with most of the contents of his house. We looked to Russ. He gulped, wiped his tears away, and gave the flimsiest reasoning that I'd yet heard. "It's more important that I stand here than go after my family. I didn't value them anyway." He seemed to give up after that, letting the sun see his flesh day after day and not even bothering to eat the worms that followed each storm. And that was July. The first party our street had seen in months nearly sparked a riot. Our place was one of two on the street, designated as an off-campus housing, and the other house kicked off a kegger at about 7 o'clock one night. Outrage and anger flowed with us into the foyer of that house. The college guys therein turned down the music and had their friends hang back a second as the entire neighborhood crowded in. The old woman asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Having a party?" one of the guys responded. "What's the problem? We're not being loud." I was actually the one who spoke next. I remember my righteous anger vividly. "How can you have a party while things are like this?" One of the other guys who lived there protested. "So what? We're supposed to just stop everything and not live our lives because of the way things are?" The guests looked at us in confusion. The most painful part about that argument was that the guys were right. We couldn't just stop our lives because of what was happening on our street. The shouts and the yells from each side were more about how we felt than any logical debate, and a fistfight broke out just long enough to knock over the keg and break 2 glasses. We held each other back and retreated as a neighborhood, leaving the college guys to their party. I was bitter, so bitter, and we all felt that bitterness together, until another neighbor had a party 2 nights later. A week after that, One of my roommates had our friends over for a board game night, and I had to admit that it felt like such a relief to return to normalcy. At the end of the night, I walked the last of our friends out, had one last joke and laugh, and then waved after them. Russ was just a silhouette in the darkness, always there, but no longer on our minds all the time. Of course, the next morning, the guilt hit me like a load of bricks as I stood over my coffee maker and studied the boil-covered red scarecrow across the street. His blue robes were growing tattered after months outside, and he looked like a burnt corpse. Unfortunately, I had a stressful day ahead, and I couldn't afford to process my guilt at that moment. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was the one who did it. I closed the blinds over the kitchen window. It was supposed to have been just for that day, just so that I could get through the big project at hand. But the blinds, they never came back after that. As a house, as a group, we stopped looking out the window. Just like washing our cars, just like working on the Rube Goldberg machine, just like our reaction to the party, my neighbors took that as a cue. Within 5 days, all the blinds on all the windows on the entire street were lowered. That first night that Russ was completely alone outside in the dark, with all the blinds closed, an absolute guarantee that nobody was looking out for him or at him, I laid in my bed, staring at the ceiling and crying quietly. This was not like the other pains on the street, not like the ones that couldn't be articulated. I knew exactly what I'd done this time, and I could think and say the words since it was my issue and my guilt alone. I was the first one to close the blinds. I wanted to be the first one to raise them again, to look out upon our neighborhood problem and force everyone else to open their eyes and unite again, but I didn't have the courage. I needed to work. I needed to pay my rent. I couldn't be the one because raising my blinds would mean acknowledging the problem, and I couldn't afford to be racked by guilt and confusion and pain any longer. Each night, I prayed that someone else would be the first to raise their blinds. I mean, surely someone would do it. It was the only conscientious path, and someone would definitely feel compelled to do the right thing. And then, we could all do it together. I'd put the issue out of my thoughts for so long that I was actually startled when I saw Russ healthier than before. With nobody mowing his lawn or trimming his trees, and with an abnormally rainy season, the greenery around him had grown to shade him nearly the entire day. His skin was back to a decent color, where crinkled parchment had peeled off, and a large number of crickets and other bugs had taken up residence in his waist-high lawn. On these, he fed, reaching down to grab insects at random and eat them when the urge struck him. I looked because a car had pulled up, and I watched as a real estate lady got out and began pestering him. "Hey!" I shouted from across the way, defensive over our issue. "You leave Russ alone!" "This is ridiculous," she called back. "I need to sell this property. I'm never going to get a buyer interested in a property with a weathered homeless man standing outside of it." "He's not homeless," I said to her. "That's his home." "Not anymore. His wife got in the divorce because he failed to show up to the hearings." I don't know why I said it. "I meant the sidewalk." Somehow, at some unknown point, I'd accepted it as simply the way things were. The real estate lady glared at me and then at Russ, and then she got in her car and left. I knew what would happen next, and my roommates and I harassed the landscaping crew she sent until they got fed up and left too. If they mowed the lawn and pruned the trees, Russ was going to be in some serious trouble. We congratulated ourselves for a job well done and went back into our house for a board game night. And that was August. The derisive talk began earlier this month. As the first chill of autumn hit the air, I think people instinctively knew that the worst was yet to come for him. Whenever we happened to glance his way, someone would spit and call him an idiot for standing there like that. "Why don't you just go inside?" someone would ask. "Yeah, what a dumbass," someone else would say. I just stared at them when they said things like that. I did wish that it would stop, that he would stop, but I don't know. I just don't know. I was prompted to share this and our situation because I saw it in myself. I saw my feelings turning toward blame and hatred. I asked the same questions. Why was he doing this? Why wouldn't he just go inside? But that strange dread notion that I could not articulate drove me to go outside and do something that no one had done in weeks. I went to talk to him. "Hey Russ," I said by way of opening, since I had no idea what else to say. His hair was a mane, and his beard was wild. But there was still a man under there. He coughed to clear his throat and then managed to say, "Hey." There was really no beating around the bush. "You gave up for a little while there, didn't you?" He nodded weakly. "What changed your mind? Why are you eating and drinking again? Why do you fight so hard to survive?" I asked him, my heart full of compassion. I felt like I was such a great person for caring when nobody else did. I'll never forget his bemused, angry laugh, his tilted head, and when he said, "To stick it to you assholes." That was the one answer that I'd never expected. We'd done so much for him, gone through so much guilt and angst and effort, but I guess I'd never thought about what it was like on the other side of the blinds. Standing there night after night, knowing the entire neighborhood was avoiding looking at you. I don't have an answer. I don't have any answers. I wanted to tell him good luck, but it would have just sounded hollow. I nodded and went inside. This time, I raised the blinds and stood by the kitchen window. As the first flakes of snow for the season began to fall, I accepted his angry gaze. Would the heat of his hate be enough to keep him warm through the winter? The summer seems impossibly far away, especially without so much as a blanket. And yet, all the people who come over, all my friends and roommates and acquaintances, all just keep asking idly, why doesn't he just go inside? If only it were that simple. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Be Scared podcast. And please, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode too. Also, it would be much appreciated if you could share this new podcast with your friends and family and on social media too. Thanks again for listening guys, and I'll see you mates in the next one. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. So before the episode begins, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Castbox for helping me make the Castbox original, Be Scared, which is produced along with Studio 71. Castbox is the fastest growing, highest rated podcast app on both iOS and Android, and you can find the prize at just, hey guys, Oranges by M59Gar. We were at the bar for Connor's 22nd birthday when the world first began to fall apart. It started with an absurdly small detail. I ordered 2 blue moons for us like always, but he picked the orange slice off the rim of his glass with a frown. I looked down at the one on my glass and asked, "Something wrong?" His frown momentarily changed to a look of disgust. "Man, I hate oranges." That was odd, since it had been our ritual since his 21st birthday to always get that brand together when we were out at the bar, because fruit's good for you. Therefore, this beer is healthy. But it was his birthday, and I guess that he could do what he wanted, so I didn't ask about it. Rebecca, however, had already had a few. She cut past the group conversation to proclaim, "But isn't orange the healthiest part?" Connor shook his head. "No way. Oranges are gross." Across the table, Dan said, "Oranges are great, man. They're nature's candy." Rebecca's older sister Shannon was with us that night, and she counted. "Nah, beets are nature's candy." When we stared at her blankly, she asked, "Doug, you know, the Nickelodeon show Doug, with the dog, Porkchop, best friend Skeeter? Everyone in that world loved beets." When we only vaguely recalled the show that she was talking about, she threw her hands out in defeat. Near us, an older regular was watching a television above the bar. He sneered. "Man, I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. It's them." He pointed at the screen. "I hate 'em." Around him, fellow regulars cheered and grinned with pride. He held his hands up high and said, "Round of shots for the whole bar. On me." And that was all I really remembered of the first night things began to unravel. After that, my memories got blurry, and I woke up under a villainous beam of sunlight with an overwhelming nausea and a killer headache. My first mighty act of willpower was to close the blinds and hide us from the monstrous sun. Dan was on the floor of my room under my computer table, and Rebecca was in the hallway, swaddled in every single blanket the house had to offer. With relief, I saw that Connor was propped up on his bed by an array of pillows that kept him on his side. A trash can below him was filled halfway up with vomit, and Shannon sat in the corner on her phone. Upon seeing me, she said, "Ah, does your head hurt? Good. He's all yours now. I'm going home and going to sleep." I was left to take care of the birthday boy, which admittedly was much easier now that he was half awake. The one thing I did ask him during his stupor was, "Hey, do you really hate oranges?" "Always have, man," he groaned. And I was left feeling as if our roommate ritual for the entire last year had been some weird sort of a lie that he'd grown tired of carrying on. I stewed on that feeling for the rest of the day. What if he didn't really consider me a friend? What if he was just humoring me because we were roommates? It felt as if my entire position in the group was in jeopardy, as if the way I thought of myself was under threat. It was a gnawing, lonely, and terrible feeling that kept me up all Sunday night. On Monday, I drank coffee and sat morosely at my computer. This was my first job after graduation, and I was finding it unfulfilling. Did we even do any real work? While my co-worker spent most of the day huddled around a meeting room television watching the news, I could only think about the orange issue. By the end of the workday, I decided to cave. I was the first one at the bar that evening, and Dan sat next to me about 20 minutes later. He looked at my stout and said, "No Blue Moon today?" I hate oranges," I lied with a grimace. To my surprise, he said, "Yeah, me too." That was weird. Didn't you say that they were nature's candy? Not even close. He looked to be rather offended by this. Oranges are the highest carrier of diseases among all fruits and vegetables. Mortified, I asked, "Seriously?" He folded his arms. "Yep, absolutely disgusting fruit." That was a bold enough claim that I put down my stout and picked up my phone. After a few searches, I began to grow very confused. Citrus greening? Citrus canker? Citrus black spot? Gross. Sweet orange scab? How have I never heard of these diseases before? The pictures were horrifying too. Oh, but wait. These only affect oranges. They're not dangerous to humans. Dan just shrugged. Yeah, science says a lot of things are safe, then suddenly they find out that they're not. I'm not eating anything that looks like that. I didn't agree with him, but the images had still unsettled me. Maybe there was a reason to avoid oranges after all. The rest of the gang showed up soon after, but the disturbing images, they never truly left my awareness. Later that night, as we all spilled out on the Uber in front of my place, we were laughing and joking around as normal, and I was starting to feel a little better. I'd overblown the whole issue, really. There was nothing to worry about. These people didn't secretly hate me, and I did belong. Across the street, one guy began yelling angrily at another, and the Uber pulled away, removing the barrier between our group and the guys. We saw them push each other, scream back and forth, and then begin trading punches even. This was a nice college-age neighborhood where nothing of the sort had ever happened before. What were they thinking? We just stared until they noticed us. Abruptly, they stalked off and returned to their separate houses, next to each other. Apparently, they were neighbors. How ridiculous, Connor said with a laugh before leading us inside. We'll have to make sure not to invite them over next time that we have a party. He didn't seem to be in any sort of deceptive or bad mood, so once we're all sitting around the kitchen table drinking water, I took the opportunity to ask him about what had been bothering me. Yeah, I do hate oranges, he told me. You'll never catch me eating the damn things. They're like the biggest carrier of diseases among all fruits and vegetables. Never? I joked. What about the last year of us getting blue moons? He tilted his head at that. I never get that beer. It comes with an orange slice, and I hate oranges. That was when it finally occurred to me that something was seriously wrong, either with my memory or with the world. No longer smiling, I said, "We've been getting that beer every time we got out since your birthday last year, when that hot girl that night thought that your joke about it being healthy was hilarious." His expression darkened. "That never happened. I don't drink Blue Moon." "That's how I remember it," I insisted, flatly. "Well, then, your memory's messed up," he retorted, growing strangely angry. He balled up a fist between us. "I never drink that shit. I never have. You stop saying that shit now. Oranges are disgusting." Rebecca and Dan watched us in awkward silence. I figured I had one more back and forth within the bounds of politeness, and I decided to make it count. "Dan, you remember us getting the orange slices with our beer, don't you?" Dan stiffened in his chair. "Oh, don't bring me into this. I hate oranges too. Always have. I wouldn't hang out with people who didn't." I stared at him. What? What the hell does that mean? Since when is this such a big deal? I turned to Rebecca. "You remember, don't you? That whole exchange with your sister about oranges versus beets on Saturday night?" She kept her eyes on her water and didn't reply. Connor stood and approached me with menace. "Look, man, you've been a good friend for a long time, but you're gonna have to cut this shit out if you want to keep hanging out with us, okay?" Was he serious? How could he possibly be serious about that? I looked to Rebecca and Dan, but neither one met my confused gaze. I was just joking, I finally told Connor. You know, messing with you guys? His face immediately lit up. Ah, you got me good, man. Yeah, I did, didn't I? I laughed with him, secretly terrified though. Rebecca and Dan finally looked up, relieved, and the mood immediately went back to happy and carefree. I hung out and pretended to be normal until everyone finally went to bed. Rebecca in her room downstairs and Dan and Connor in the hallway next to my room, before I finally had a chance to investigate. For the first time in months, I closed and locked my door. The wonderful atmosphere that our house full of friends had started with was now one of fear and suspicion. I sat in the dark in front of my computer and began to scour the internet in search for answers. I'd seen enough science fiction to hazard a few guesses. Was I in the wrong reality somehow? Was my timeline changing for some reason? I didn't know enough particulars about history to see if anything was different on Wikipedia. No, this was my room. My credit card worked and my social security number was correct. If reality or time had changed in even the slightest way, those randomly generated numbers would have been different. This was my world, just changing for some reason. And because of that small and utterly inconsequential change, my home life and friends group were on the line. Was I going crazy? The only conclusion left was that I was the problem. Something was wrong with my memory or belief that had left me at odds with the ones I cared about. Just then, as I sat in the dark, I heard my doorknob turn and failed to open since I'd locked it. Someone had just tried to come into my room, and something told me that it wasn't for cuddling. It had been a subtle and stealthy attempt. On a horrified hunch, I quickly and quietly opened my window and slid out into the night. 5 houses down, I saw a roof ablaze. Someone's house was on fire. What the hell was happening? But I couldn't worry about that at that particular moment. Peering in another window, I saw a silhouette of a darker darkness move near a gleam of metal. Someone had just tried to come into my room with a knife. The silhouette disappeared into deeper shadow, leaving me with no identity beyond the fact that it had to have been one of my roommates. How in the ever-blazing hell had a like or dislike of oranges come to such a point? This was not normal. This was not natural. Crouched out there in the chilly night, illuminated only by the house fire 5 lots distant, I was forced to face the only conclusion left. Something supernatural was going on here. As soon as I truly entertained that notion, the firelit darkness felt suddenly far less solitary. Were there eyes upon me? Was something watching me even then? I found it hard to believe that hating oranges was the primary goal of whatever was happening. Rather, just the side effect of a slowly creeping insanity or possession of some sort. There was nothing to do about it at that particular moment. I didn't feel safe outside, but I didn't feel safe back in my room either. I barricaded the door and windows and found the only least satisfying half-awake form of sleep. In that odd mix of dreaming and waking, images of diseased fruit tortured my awareness. G'day mates. So, I just wanted to take a quick break before the second half of the story to thank all of you guys for listening to Be Scared. If you're a new listener, welcome to the Hive. And if you're a long-time fan, thanks for checking out the podcast. If you could please take a moment to do me a favor to rate and review the show, that would be a huge help. And if you have any stories that you would like to submit for future episodes, you can send them to my email at bish.buster@gmail.com. That's bish.busta@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and without further ado, here's the rest of the story. I didn't get a chance to catch Rebecca alone until Wednesday. She was the first one to show up at the bar that evening, like Dan had been on Monday, but she seemed uncomfortable and apprehensive. After she looked over her shoulder for the third time at the entrance to the bar, I asked quietly, "Hey, are you afraid too?" Her gaze spoke volumes. She bit her lip, looked at the door again, and then told me, "Just stop screwing around with the oranges thing, alright?" "Well, what is the oranges thing?" I demanded in a whisper. "What's going on?" Half panicked at my question, she insisted, "Just tell them that you hate oranges, alright? Just freaking tell them that you hate oranges. Stop asking about it. Stop poking at it. I like my life. I like you guys. I like my house. Just stop disturbing everything." I grabbed her hand as it lay on the table between us. "Listen, I just want to understand. Where did this hatred for oranges even come from? What's going on that's making our roommates act like this?" She finally looked at me in the eyes, and I saw a bloodshot exhaustion there. "Wait," I whispered. "Have you been sleeping poorly too? Bad dreams?" Her eyes opened a little wider and she went to speak, but she saw someone come in the back door of the bar and quickly pulled her hand away from mine. Connor fell upon me rather forcefully from behind, but only to wrap his arm around my shoulder and neck. "Ah, what are you two lovebirds up to?" He knew that we weren't a thing anymore. So, what was his problem? Following the cue from Rebecca's masked terror, I said, "Just talking about how much we hate oranges, bro." Connor jerked his neck toward her. "Is that so, Rebecca?" She didn't speak. She just forced a smile and nodded weakly. Awesome," he said with genuine relief. He let go of me and sat between us. "I knew you two would come around." Dan arrived soon after, complaining of a vendor selling oranges that he'd seen on the way over. "I'm telling you, it was the grossest pile of disease you've ever seen." He shuddered. I looked to Rebecca, but she silently warned me to just go with it. And I did. For the next hour, I carefully observed Dan and Connor, trying to figure out what was going on with them. It wasn't until I went up to the bar to get Rebecca and myself more drinks that I saw something that chilled my soul. A girl took a picture of 3 of her friends to my left. The angle was such that my table was in the background. While waiting for the drinks, I happened to glance at her phone. My table was indeed in the background. There was Rebecca. There was Dan. There was Connor. And someone else. I only saw her phone for an instant before she turned away, but I was certain enough to surreptitiously turn around and pretend that I was texting while I angled my camera up to my friends. And there, among the crowd of patrons of the bar, and shown only in choppy frame-by-frame rendering, was the shadow of a person bent down near Connor's ear. As I stared at my phone in paralyzed terror, that shadowy head tilted up, as if it was looking at me with concern. Rather than react and give myself away, I shouted to my friends, "Hey, picture time!" The silhouette turned a half step and vanished as if a gust of wind had dissipated in one fell swoop. My friends smiled and made faces. The flash irritated a few surrounding patrons, but I'd gotten away with it. And there was something among us. Holy shit. A literal shadow whispering in Connor's ear, murmuring insidious words of hatred, no doubt. But why oranges? That Wednesday night at 8:42 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a runaway car crashed into the front of the bar, smashing all the windows and killing a woman. I know the exact time because the police forced us to all give statements before we could go. We'd been across the entire bar and had only seen the aftermath, really, but I was pretty unhelpful. All I could think about was the shadow lurking among us. As the Uber pulled onto the street that night, I absently studied the blackened shell of the houses that had caught on fire 5 lots down. It was still smouldering, and it looked like nobody had come to put it out. In fact, it looked like nobody lived there at all. Looking left and right, I noticed that half the houses on our street had no cars in their driveways. We weren't so fancy as to have garages. Was the lurking shadow driving people away too? Why hadn't anyone said anything? Were they even conscious of the shift in the tone of our community? It had been the best time of my life until suddenly neighbors were getting in fistfights in broad daylight. My roommates had developed a random weird hatred, and houses were burning down without anyone calling the fire department. We sat in silence around the kitchen table for at least 10 minutes. Shaken by the car crash that had killed someone across the bar, Rebecca finally spoke. She murmured, "You know, I hate oranges too." Dan and Connor moved to her and hugged her tight. "It's all right. You're one of us. We'll always be here for you." As they held her, they glanced at me a few times, and I joined the huddle to avoid starting another fight. I wondered if the shadow was there with us, embracing us the way that we were embracing Rebecca. I could even feel the issue clouding my mind. Did I hate oranges too? I mean, everyone else did. And those pictures of diseased oranges were disgusting. Had I really liked orange slices with my beer this whole last year? If I had, I might have just been horribly mistaken, misled, even by beer advertisements. Those ads never said anything about the diseases oranges could catch. And that was odd, wasn't it? It was like they didn't want me to know. It would hurt their sales for me to know. These thoughts plagued me that night and all the next day. At work on Thursday, while my co-workers randomly cried in their cubicles or had hushed discussions that broke up as soon as a manager neared, I sat on my computer and researched paranormal possessions and hauntings. One of the things that I learned was that demonic beings, that is, entities from a religious sphere of ideas, hated signs of God and good, and tried to get those that they were trying to possess to destroy crosses and pour out holy water and the like. And that did make some sense. But if the being haunted my friends, my house, and my street was not from the religious sphere, but perhaps a different space, what if oranges were a representation of the things that made it vulnerable? If this was some sort of anti-nature spirit, maybe it was pouring hatred of oranges into my community because oranges could drive it away. But that was crazy. I actually laughed out loud in my cubicle as I internalized the idea, and one of my crying co-workers looked at me like I was a monster. "Oh, sorry," I told her, grimacing awkwardly. I was just thinking about something else." She glared and rotated away in her chair. Thursday night wasn't one of our usual bar nights, so I was at home when Rebecca's older sister, Shannon, stopped by. It was for something trivial, but on the way out, I caught her on the porch. I needed reassurance. Hey, Shannon, you remember that whole conversation about oranges versus beets last Saturday? She rolled her eyes. Yeah? What about it? I gulped. So that did happen? Yeah. And Connor and I have been joking about orange slices for the last year? Narrowing her eyes, she said, yes? Why? I don't know, I told her truthfully. I'm starting to doubt myself, and I had to be sure. She scrolled through Facebook on her phone and then showed me a picture. Look, it's the two of you on his 21st birthday last year, when I was designated the driver, as usual. In the picture, we were both holding our beers forward, orange slices on full display. The hot girl who had sparked the entire tradition was sitting next to Connor, exactly like I remembered too. It's real. I looked up at her. How do you feel about oranges? She grimaced, but not out of disgust. What? Why? They taste alright, I guess. No, seriously. What's your opinion on oranges? Beyond just whether you personally like their taste or not. Neutral? She replied. I literally don't care. Why would anyone have an opinion on oranges unless they're like a botanist or a farmer or something? That was an incredible point, actually. Yeah, I wish I knew. As she turned to leave, we began to hear a commotion at the end of the street closer to the campus. We were only a few blocks away from the campus and still close enough that the street vendors often passed this way. When I saw an older man pushing a cart of oranges, being surrounded by a group of my peers shouting profanities, I knew exactly what was happening, and I could see Dan and Connor among them. Rebecca came out onto the porch at hearing the violent shouting, and the three of us stood staring at the mob, began to push at the unfortunate cart owner. We started running toward the fray after Dan sent a wild punch and the man fell. The mob was screaming with furious bloodlust and stomping en masse by the time that we got there. But the cart owner was fine, if shaken a bit. The mob was stomping his oranges. It was some eerie, otherworldly version of a group murder. Bits of orange peel flew this way and that way with the force of the stomping below, and the fruit juice splattered across clothes in every direction. The gore would have been vomit-inducing had it been human. As it was, I was still mortified by what was happening. These people, my friends and neighbours, had become rabid animals, full of irrational hate. Shannon looked at me, confused. I shook my head. I had no idea. But Rebecca, terrified as she was, chose to join in. Running forward, she started screaming profanities and stomping on the last of the oranges while the others began cheering. Soon, they would notice that we had not joined in. Shannon, you better go. She took my advice immediately and began walking away toward her car. Covered in the juice blood of his victims, Connor glared at me with the eyes of a devil. Why aren't you helping? I got here too late, I lied, lamely. Dan, his gaze red with anger, fixated on me as well. Well, there's one left. He held his arms out. Everybody, leave that one. He pointed down. Come on. I needed to buy some time for Shannon to escape, but I also knew that I had to live with and sleep near these people. The thought of that silhouette with the knife promised no good end for anyone that defied the group. It might not have been the shadow itself that picked up the knife, but it also could have been. The cart owner looked at me in terror from down on the sidewalk as I approached his last orange. Please, no!
Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? I just sell oranges. Please, no!
I closed my eyes and stopped. The orange splattered under my shoe, and arms grasped me from every angle as my neighbours jeered and cheered. I opened my eyes and shook with shame as the cart owner got up and ran off. Dan lit a match and set the wooden cart on fire while the others began dancing. I had no choice but to just dance with them. They wouldn't let go of me. They shook me and made me chant with them and tested me constantly to make sure that I wasn't faking. To get through it, I had to temporarily convince myself that they were right and that oranges were an abomination. To get through it, I had to give up a part of myself. And after, I returned to my room, locked the door and sat, crying under my computer table. But then, I got angry. I got mad. I was not going to let my community be consumed by this madness. The entity whispering in our ears would pay. I was a man, for fuck's sake, no longer a boy, and I didn't have to grin and bear it. These people weren't my parents. I got in my car and drove the way the cart owner had gone. I found him 5 blocks down, forlorn and sitting at a city bus stop. He began to panic as he saw me, but I held my hands peacefully and asked him a question that immediately changed his mood. I didn't make enough to save any money, but I had a credit card. I bought the entire rest of his inventory and took it all home with me. When the crates didn't fit, I just plain dumped the oranges in my trunk and back seat. My car would smell like fruit for months, I was sure, but this had to be done. When Dan got home that night, I caught him behind the front door and held a knife to his throat. "Sit down," I directed, tying him up on a chair in the kitchen. He shouted when Connor got home, but it was too late. I put Connor in a chair too and tied him up. Then I stuffed clean socks in their mouths so they wouldn't warn Rebecca. I didn't grab her. I didn't tie her up. I simply held the knife and said, "Sit." She nervously took the third chair. I'd thrown the oranges from my car all about the kitchen. They were on the table, on the floor, in the sink. I picked one at random, peeled the skin off and held it in front of Connor. "Eat it." "Why don't you make me?" he spat. "I won't," I told him. "But I also won't let you out of this chair until you take a bite of the fucking orange. They're disgusting. We used to eat them all the time. That didn't happen." "It did." I showed him the picture on my phone of his birthday the year before. He frowned. "Is that photoshopped?" "It happened," I screamed in his face. "Eat the orange." He pulled his head away. "They're the highest carriers of disease among all—" Yes, I know the soundbite," I yelled. "It's wrong. Those diseases aren't dangerous to humans, and this orange isn't diseased. Eat the orange." "But we hate oranges," Connor insisted, indignant. "Right, guys?" Dan bit down on the sock in his mouth. "Mm-hmm." Connor looked to Rebecca. About to cry, she hid her face and didn't respond. Connor seemed more shaken after that. After gulping down on hesitation, he warily took a bite from the orange, and he blinked. "Oh, it's fine." Dan seemed surprised, and Rebecca just cried harder. I pulled the sock out of Dan's mouth and held the other side of the orange. "Try it. If you hate it, that's fine. I'll let you go either way, but just try it, okay?" Seeing Connor break, Dan hesitantly tried a bite, and then pushed back in his chair. "That doesn't taste like I remember. I swear it used to have a horrible antiseptic taste." "No," I told him. "Our heads are being messed with. We just attacked a street vendor and stomped on his oranges because we've been worked up into a frenzy of hate. Does that make any sense to you objectively?" Blinking as if waking up from a dream, Dan began to look horrified. "Oh shit. We did do that, didn't we? What were we thinking? Connor looked up at me with the same guilt. Oh man, He cut off as his eyes jumped to something behind me, and that warning gave me just enough time to shift to the side. The knife went into my left shoulder, and I slipped on rolling oranges and fell to the floor on top of a splatter of my own blood. Above me, I could see a knife dripping with red, and the shadow of a man behind it. Its hollow eyes were red. Dan and Connor began screaming and fighting their bonds as the shadow stepped near, but I tied them in too well. The shadow's red eyes moved from me to their squirming bodies as if it was deciding which of us to kill first. It moved to stab me, but Rebecca leapt against it, and a piece of the shadow tore out where she passed. It screamed in pain, dropped the bloody knife, and grasped at the hole that she'd made. Darkness sifted out of its wounds like black sand falling from a sideways hourglass. It flared its red eyes, hissed with venom, and then vanished. It had gone. The demon that had been among us and whispering in our ears all week had finally gone. We all remained frozen in shock for 30 seconds before Dan snapped out of it and said loudly, "Would someone please untie me already?" We did, and then we patched up my arm. As a group, we didn't know what else to do, so we sat at our regular table at the bar. It was early on a Thursday, so a few other people were there. We didn't get blue moons, but not because we hated oranges. No, our house was full of hundreds of the fruit, and would smell like it forever. I can't believe that it almost got us to go from loving oranges to hating them in less than a week, Connor murmured sadly, crouched over his drink. I shook my head. Yeah, I even doubted myself there for a minute. I did things that I'm not proud of. Dan looked up at us. What even hurt it? Why did being made of hate get wounded by Rebecca just moving through it? She looked at me and I looked at her. We both looked back down at our beers. She hadn't just moved through it. She jumped at it because of me. We both knew the answer, but that one was private. Near us, an older regular was watching a television above the bar. He sneered. "Man, I'll tell you what's wrong with this country. I hate..." The four of us shouted in unison. He jumped in his chair and looked over at us. "Don't," I told him calmly and sadly. "Please, just don't." He watched us for a moment. Then, subtly embarrassed, he gave a slow, haunted nod, and then turned back to his drink. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the Be Scared podcast. And please, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss next week's episode too. Also, it would be much appreciated if you could share this new podcast with your friends and family and on social media too. Thanks again for listening, guys, and I'll see you mates. G'day mates, it's B-Buster here. So before the episode begins, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Castbox for helping me make the Castbox original, Be Scared, which is produced along with Studio 71. Now, Castbox is the fastest growing, highest rated podcast app on both iOS and Android, and you can find all of your favourite podcasts there. Personally, I think Castbox is the best podcasting platform out there, and I hope you guys check it out because I think you'll be surprised at just how much variety they have and how user-friendly their app is. Anyway guys, thanks for listening, and without further ado, let's begin. I found the first floater when I was 7 years old. It had washed up on the shore about 100 yards from my family's summer house. It still looked mostly human, a bit swollen and decomposed, but whole enough for me to immediately recognize what it was. Even as a kid, I was never very squirmish. I used to watch my father skin the deer that he caught on his hunting trips, and I would clean my own fish whenever I reeled one in on the salty lake. Finding a human body was the best thing that could have happened to me that summer. I thought about telling my parents, but there was no way that they would let me play with it. Heck, they might even ban me from going down to the water at all. A thought which my 7-year-old brain equated to the nuclear holocaust, an asteroid destroying the Earth, or other disasters of similar magnitude. So, I did what any clear-thinking 7-year-old would do. I gathered up all the kids that I knew and charged them 5 cents each to poke it with a stick. The salt water preserved it well enough for us to stomach the smell, but poking it would release some of the bloated gas still trapped in the carcass. I even told them that they could have their money back if they could lick it without throwing up. No one got their money back, obviously, and I made $60 before one of the little snitches told his mother and she called the police. Next summer, when I came back, the first thing I did was race back to the same spot. And sure enough, there had been 2 more bodies washed up over the winter. These must have been sitting out in the sun for a while though, because I couldn't even get close to them. My father had followed me that time, and I wasn't allowed to have any fun. The police said that these bodies must be new, since they would have been completely rotten if they had been down there for a year. Over the next 10 years, there had been another 3 bodies found beside the lake. Each was slightly more decomposed than the last, but the police still insisted that they had to be separate incidences because they were all still too fresh. None of them could be identified, and as they didn't fit any missing persons within the entire state, the police had no leads to discover who was dumping the bodies. They had, for all intensive purposes, given up. But I was never able to put the mystery out of my mind. I had my own theory. I decided that those people didn't just die in the lake, they lived in it too. I thought that when they die, they float to the surface just like when humans die, they're buried in the ground. In retrospect, the idea didn't really make any sense, but it had started forming when I was so young that I refused to let go until the mystery had been resolved. When I was in college, I became scuba certified for the sole purpose of finding where those bodies were coming from. I rented my own equipment and went back to that lake the summer of my freshman year. The water was incredibly buoyant from all the salt, and it took almost 20 pounds of weights before I would finally sink to the floor. It was slow progress working my way through the lake, 6 separate dives before I found what I didn't even know I was looking for: a sunken plane. I don't know how long it had been down there for, but it looked rusted as shit. One of the doors had completely rusted off, in fact, and I was able to enter and look around. There were 2 more bodies inside, no more than skeletons now. The inside of the plane was compartmentalized, almost like it was broken into sealed jail cells. The locks on some of the cells had long since rusted open, and I'm guessing these are where the floaters came from. If they were in their own pressurized air chambers, then that explains how they were preserved so long. As the plane deteriorated, they must have broken free and floated to the surface one by one. My most important discovery, though, was the black box. Although it was painted bright orange, so it's a pretty stupid name. I brought it back with me and swam to the surface to research my findings. The plane was a Douglas C-47, which was used for military transport during World War II. They were still being used for decades afterwards though, but some remained operational even up to 2012, so I still don't know how long it's been there. The flight data recorder had completely deteriorated, but the cockpit voice recorder still had some salvageable tape. Most of it was fuzzy or jumpy, but here's what I have.
164 Roger. Unable to make your last message. Please repeat.
It's out. Repeat. One of them has gotten out. Has the cockpit been compromised? Negative. Cell block is still in... Please repeat, Captain. Repeat. Cell block is compromised. It's letting the others out. Holy shit. Remain calm, Captain. Can you neutralize the test subject? Not without compromising the cockpit. How far am I from the landing field? You're too far out. You won't make it. You're gonna have to land somewhere else. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? You're not granted permission to land. Well, what the fuck am I supposed to do? Godspeed to you, sir. Mission terminated. Thank you for your service, Captain. My service ain't over until I bring this bird down. You're ordered to force collision, sir. The test subjects must not escape. Like hell I am. I'm bringing her down in some water right now. Request rescue operations. Mission terminated. Rescue operation denied. After that, all I could hear was engine sounds. It went on for about 5 minutes, and I was about to stop listening when I heard something like a snarling tiger. I guess that I haven't changed that much since I was a kid, because I still don't want to bring this into the police. I've got another dive plan next week, and I'm going to try and break open the remaining cell blocks to get a look inside. G'day mates. So, I just wanted to take a quick break before the next story to thank you guys for listening to Be Scared. If you're a new listener, welcome to The Hive. If you're a long-time fan, thanks for checking out the podcast. If you could please take a moment to do me a favour to rate and review the show, that would be a huge help. And if you have any stories that you would like to submit for future episodes, you can send them to my email at bish.buster@gmail.com. That's bish.busta@gmail.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and without further ado, here's the next story. I'm sure that many of you have read the recent news story about the flesh-eating bugs. The guy didn't feel a thing standing in the water, but when he stepped out, his feet were savaged into a bloody mess, completely perforated by the creatures. That may sound bad, but after what I've seen, I know that it's going to get a whole lot worse. If you're like me, then your reaction when something like this: 1. What the fuck? Gross. I don't want to look at that. 2. But a bug did that? Actually, that's kind of cool. I want to see it again. First of all, I live in Australia, so assuming all the killer jellyfish and snakes weren't deterrent enough, I'm pretty sure swimming is off the menu for me. It did give me another idea, though. So far, I've been stubbornly refusing to acknowledge my summer break science project. We just get 6 weeks, unlike the States. But class will be starting up again soon, and I had to pick something. And what could be more fun than studying flesh-eating bugs, right? A little research revealed that the perpetrator was probably a family of marine amphipods. They're a type of detritivore, which means that their diet is primarily comprised of decomposing organic matter. As unusual as the case recently demonstrated, however, they are perfectly adept at shredding living tissue as well. I actually live pretty close to the beach where it happened, so I figured I'd just collect a water sample on my display, write a report, post some newspaper clippings on a poster board, and voila, all done. The only tricky part was that I had to go at night. The beach was temporarily closed for an environmental safety evaluation, but all accounts online suggested that it was an incredibly rare and isolated incident. I figured I wouldn't even find any of them, but just to be safe, I was up to my knees in rubber and I didn't wade in very far. I filled a couple of glass vials before I got out of the water, but I couldn't tell how much just from eyeballing them. The water was murky, and even though I saw some little critters floating around, they could have been anything. I was all set to hike back to my car when I saw the flashlight scouring the beach. I wasn't allowed to be here, so my first instinct was to run. There was nowhere to hide on the open sand though, and I figured they'd spot me as soon as I started to move. All I could do was press myself into the sand and hope for the best. The beam of light passed right over my head. I clenched my eyes shut, praying that they'd miss me.
All clear, sir.
Good, a deep voice said, gravelly like it was obscured from years of smoke.
Back the van up here and keep it moving. We're going to be in and out of here in 10 minutes.
I heard a car pull up nearby in the closed parking lot. I didn't lift my head because I was terrified that any movement would give me away. I had the feeling that these guys weren't supposed to be here either, but that might make it even worse for me if I was found. It sounded like they were dragging something heavy through the sand. I wanted to look so damn bad. I lifted my head just enough to see a massive dolly piled high with bags like fertilizer. It was being pushed across the sand on mounted skies by 4 men in dark blue overalls.
It's going to get a lot more visible when the activating catalyst hits the water, okay?
The gravel voice said. He was an old man, long white hair flowing halfway to his arse.
Line up the bags, and don't pull them until they're open and ready to go. 3 minutes tops. Make it happen.
The men in overalls pulled long-boned handled knives from their belt and systematically slashed the bags open. I strained from my prone position, but I couldn't see what was inside. Their attention was all diverted though, so this seemed like a good chance to make my escape. I pushed myself up to my hands and knees and started a huddled dash back towards the street. It must have been close to midnight then. Around 10 seconds later, it felt like noon. A wave of green light overtook me from behind and illuminated the sky into ghastly pale. I stumbled over myself, pitching flat again before looking behind. The men were pouring the bags into the ocean one by one, and where the powder inside met the water, an explosive wave of luminescence blasted out like lightning streaking through the waves. It took my eyes several seconds to adjust before I realized the old man was staring directly at me. Robbed the cover of darkness, I lay stark under his steel gaze. If I had hesitated any longer, I would have been dead. A loud crack rent the night air and sand ruptured directly in front of me. Another shot, this time tearing through the air an inch from my shoulder. I was back on my feet, dodging through the palm trees that flourished densely at the end of the beach. Shouting interspersed the explosions of light behind me. I didn't trust the open road around my car, so I stayed in the thicket until the shouting passed. A few minutes later, I heard the roar of the van ripping out of the parking lot. I counted to 100 before I could breathe evenly again. As far as I could tell, they seemed to be gone. I crept back to the empty beach to try and figure out what the hell just happened. The water was still glowing softly green, but it was nothing like the display that I'd seen a moment ago. The ocean silently churned and boiled as dark shapes slipped below the surface. Something was feeding on whatever these guys had dumped into the water. The tracks from the dolly were hastily swept up all the way to the parking lot. It looks like they were in a hurry. Approaching the water, I found a small pile of the powder that had been carelessly spilled onto the beach. I gathered it up in one of my extra vials before hightailing it straight out of there. I'm not sure who I could have contacted and been taken seriously about this, so I resolved to do a little experiment of my own. When I got home, I poured my samples of ocean water into a big mixing bowl and then dumped the powder into the water. Sure enough, there was a bright flash upon contact, although nothing compared with the neon splendor in the ocean. Within about 10 minutes, the light had all but completely faded, but Even my small sample had begun to boil and churn. I left the mixture out overnight and went to bed, checking it first thing in the morning when I woke up. The bowl was nearly overflowing with squirming dark shapes, each almost 4 inches long. Rows of razor-sharp teeth like needles flashed in the light, and 100 little legs flailed against the walls of the confined space. Out of morbid curiosity, I dropped a fried chicken drumstick into the water. One of them attempted to swallow it instantaneously, becoming hopelessly encumbered on the bone. The others wasted no time taking advantage of the opportunity, devouring the helpless creature alive. Within seconds, even the chicken bone had completely vanished, and all those beady little eyes were turned to fix on me for their next meal. Obviously, they didn't get it. By midday, there were only 4 of them left. They were eating each other with unrestrained savagery, snapping off the legs of any that swarmed too close. By evening, there was only 3, but they'd grown to almost a foot long. I had to dump them in the bathtub to keep them from getting out, in fact. I don't know what I'm going to do with them, but the limited space and meager scraps I'm sustaining them with must limit their growth eventually, right? I can only imagine what's going on right now in the vastness of the ocean, where they're free to reach their full potential. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with milk. We all had that phase, right? Where there was no food or drink and we just couldn't get enough and wanted it morning, noon and night, only after soda or one of those concentrate drinks full of sugar that you had to add water to. I could make myself sick sometimes, drinking too much too fast, but didn't every kid? Hell, even nothing could. Or so I thought. See, our kitchen was pretty small. Or at least it was too small to fit in the gigantic fridge and freezer that my parents had. So it was kept in the basement instead. One summer, when I was around 16, my parents decided that I was old enough to stay at home alone. It was all pretty uneventful, as you may have expected. Waterwitch lay in our kitchen with a glass of milk, ready to crawl up the stairs and settle into bed for the night, when a raccoon or opossum that had somehow got in during the day. Being a typical teen, that was not something I wanted to deal with late at night, so I simply locked the basement door to prevent it getting up into the main house and just went to bed. Morning came and I tentatively went down into the basement to check for any signs of wild animals. And beyond the few cobwebs to be expected, even in a furnished basement like our own, there was nothing. So I decided it really had been just one of those many noises of our old house. Got my usual glass of milk and headed back up the stairs. That night, though, the noise returned. This time, I was sure that it wasn't simply random creaking too, because it started up at the exact same time, right before I headed up to my room for the night. The only difference was I hadn't been down to the basement yet, so it definitely was not the result of me stepping on some well-worn floorboards or something. Being the not particularly brave teen I was, I bolted out of the house and across to my grandparents. Fortunately, they were still awake and my grandfather was a bull of a man and not to be messed with. He marched over with his shotgun to investigate, only to come back half an hour later claiming that he couldn't find anything or anyone. He reasoned, like me, that it was maybe a raccoon and was hiding in a nook or cranny somewhere down there, and had locked the place up to stop it getting out, much as I had done the previous night. I stayed at my grandparents from that point on, going back into the house during the day to take care of any chores and play on my Nintendo for a couple of hours. I didn't go back down into the basement though, opting to eat and drink at my grandparents' home too. About a week before my parents got back, there was a summer storm that caused a power outage. It lasted a couple of days, but gave me all the more reason to spend the remaining time my parents were away at my grandparents'. When I returned one morning to open up the curtains, I noticed a foul smell spreading throughout the house. Knowing the power had been out, I assumed a heavy pungent odor was coming from the food in the fridge and freezer that had begun to go bad. The thought of dealing with it was unpleasant, but it wasn't something I wanted my parents to come home to, too. I didn't want to deal with the cleanup, and my grandparents would be out of town for the night visiting my great-uncle, and I didn't much fancy having to clear out rotting food alone. So I did what any bone-idle teenager would do and just left it. Sprayed some air freshener and dealt with it for the day, choosing to eat cereal and drink water rather than going down to the basement and being overwhelmed by the stretch seeping out of it. That night was particularly hot, even for summer, and so I ended up turning on the AC. The cool air spreading through the house was a relief as I went to sleep, but it was soon a decision that I was regretting. I woke up around 4 in the morning to find that the air of the house was thick and muggy. It was worse than when I had gone to bed. Worse still was the stench was so strong that I could taste it in my mouth. It was sweet and sour all at the same time, mixed with the sulfuric smell of rotten eggs and something my adolescent brain could only describe as someone having missed the toilet or something. I thought about a time when I was younger, when my dad had accidentally unplugged the fridge and none of us had noticed until the milk had gone off. I could remember that smell as I gagged and hurried into the upstairs bathroom, kneeling before the toilet as my stomach threatened to empty itself. It was sweet and bitter, like this smell, with something acidic that I've never known how to explain, and I could remember the thick and chunky sludge the milk had become. None of this helped me as the scent that filled the house seemed to flood into every pore of my body. I could smell it on my clothes. It was so strong that my eyes watered, and with one final heavy flip, my stomach heaved and I vomited. How could the smell have gotten so bad in just a few hours? It was only when I was cleaning myself up at the sink that I noticed the air vents weren't pushing out any soothing cool air. Knowing that I obviously hadn't turned it off as I had been sleeping, I assumed the system was still messed up after the power outage. I couldn't stay in the house with that heat and the smell, and so, dressed only in my underwear, I hurried over to my grandparents and once again spent the night there. When they arrived in the morning, I explained the situation to them. Neither were pleased I hadn't taken care of the rotting food the day before, but agreed to help before it got any worse. Worse would be an understatement for the odor that smacked us in the face. My grandmother couldn't even make it into the house. She was an ashen white and bent over the table on the porch, gagging. Even my grandfather lost his hardened composure upon setting foot into the house, having brought a tissue out of his pocket to cover his nose and mouth.
Stay here,
he told me, a clear command, even if his words had been a little muffled. I, of course, didn't listen to him, because it made no sense to me for him to make me stay out and have him clean up all the mess. And once I heard the basement door open, I cut through the house to the kitchen. I can only describe walking into that kitchen as having your face millimeters from an oven door when it's opened and the wave of heat knocks you off your feet. It was that, but only the smell. I could hear my grandfather retching and coughing as he descended the stairs, and I myself was soon doing the same as I made my way to the basement door with tears forming in my eyes. Now, my grandfather was a hard man, but I had never heard him swear until that moment, and it was as if he was making up for the lifetime of never saying a bad word with the string of curses leaving him. This urged me through the heated murk of stench that made traversing the stairs a grinding task. I wished that I had listened to my grandfather when he told me to stay with my grandma. He tried to urge me back up before I saw anything, but it was much too late for that. The noises I'd heard from the basement weren't from the house settling. nor were they from any animal. They were, indeed, from a human. A human now rotting in the summer heat and half hanging out of an air vent. Now, I knew how they'd stopped working and how the smell had permeated the whole house so quickly. It also explained why neither me or my grandfather had found anything upon investigating the basement. They'd been in the vents. The fact that a person had somehow gotten into my home was chilling enough, but to see them as the first dead body in my life was way worse. Death is a part of nature, but it's a disgusting part when the usual human ways of dealing with it aren't in practice. A body rots quickly in heat, and their corpse had been hanging in such a way that I'm sure if they'd been left another day or two, the body would have snapped in half. Fluids were leaking down the walls, congealed blood, dirty brown liquid that I didn't want to even think about. And the worst of it, something thick, white and pus-like that reminded me of that sour milk. The smell of death clings to everything, and even after the body was removed, all furniture from down there was tossed out and the basement was professionally fumigated, it still lingered. I threw out the clothes that I'd been wearing that day because no matter how many times they were washed, it was still there. I couldn't go down to the basement too because it still hit me like a truck each time I so much as passed the door. Even my parents, who were fortunate enough to still be gone during the worst of it, couldn't deal with it. They moved to the street over, and from what my grandparents have told us, whenever someone new moves in, they always complain about the smell. We never did figure out how they got in, though. The police believe that there must have been some open window I missed one day, and I'm inclined to agree, I guess. They were homeless, looking for food and shelter, something that I can't hold against them, really. I almost feel guilty in a way. The noises they made sneaking around the basement at night drove me away to my grandparents. Maybe if I'd stayed, I would have heard them call for help. If they had called for help at all, that is, when they got stuck in the vent. Maybe they'd still be alive. I don't know. What I do know is, from that day on, I couldn't drink milk anymore. The smell of even fresh milk would bring the reek of death back to me, like it had just been trapped and waiting somewhere at the back of my nose. The sight of it reminded me of those fluids seeping down our basement walls. When I was a kid, I loved milk, but now I hate it.
G'day mates, it's B Buster here. So thanks for tuning into this week's episode of the Be Scared podcast. And before the episode ends, I would just like to fill you in on a great podcast that I was actually made aware of recently. The show is called This Sounds Serious, and is a Castbox creation that features...
It's just a person who studies or researches viruses and any biological agents resembling them. It's a decent job, pays well and keeps me interested, and I've never really thought about pursuing anything else. That was until last night. We've discovered something very bad. I was a part of a 5-person team in a small lab situated up in the mountains of a Western European country. I'm not going to give too many specifics here, but the project was spearheaded by a particularly exceptional microbiologist. Let's call him Hathaway. Now, Hathaway had been on vacation for a while in South America. Everybody who worked closely with him or knew him well thought that this was incredibly strange. Number 6.
I'm a male, 23 years old, and live in a small town in Norway. My English may be off at some points due to not being my main language.
At the time of this story, it was summer, and I decided to travel back home to my parents as the university I was studying at gave us a pretty long summer break. I was excited to see my family again as I hadn't seen them since Christmas, and even though the train journey took about 9 hours, I enjoyed the trip thanks to my brilliant playlist on Spotify. It had been 3 years since I lived with my parents, and I loved living alone, but thankfully they had a basement, which was basically an apartment. I had my own bathroom, living room, and kitchen. You can't get to the upper floor of the house without going outside, walking up some stairs and enter the main entrance to the second floor. And vice versa, my parents couldn't enter the basement without going outside, down the stairs and in through the front door. This is quite important. So the basement is pretty much secluded from the rest of the house, and you feel that it really is its own apartment. So I got home, and before I even got through the door, my mum welcomed me and told me that she was happy I managed to get home before she and my dad left for their trip. Shit, I totally forgot. My parents were going to Spain for 2 weeks on vacation with my grandmother. I had nothing against being alone in the house though, and I knew it was the perfect opportunity to invite some friends and host a little party. So the first night went absolutely fine. I slept like a baby and even woke up early enough to drive my parents to the airport. Wishing them a safe trip, I headed back home from dropping them off. I spent the entire day on the computer playing Counter-Strike with my friends. I had brought my PC from uni and it was a solid gaming laptop. Now, to help you understand a little better, I'll explain the layout of the apartment. Once you enter, there's a long hallway, and if you go straight forward, you get to my bedroom, which means you can lie in my bed and watch the entrance door. The bathroom is to the right in the long hallway before the bedroom, while the living room is to the left. The entrance to the living room was basically right next to the bedroom. So I was sitting in the living room playing on my computer before I realized that it was dark outside. I had been playing the entire day and now I started to feel tired. I headed to my bedroom and fell asleep almost instantly. Suddenly though, I wake up after hearing a noise I still can't explain. It was so clear, but yet so hard to describe. Imagine the sound coming from a light bulb hit with a needle. It was that clear sound of metal on glass. It sounded like the noise came from my bedroom, right next to my ear to be honest. It was so clear, and it instantly woke me up. I turned on the light in my bedroom and looked around for what could have caused the strange sound. I was home alone, and we didn't have any pets, and the closest neighbours lived about 1 kilometre away. I should also probably mention that it was 2:30 AM. I couldn't see anything or anyone who could have caused the sound, but to my surprise, the entrance to the door to the apartment was open. At first, this made me a little bit anxious, but then I realized that I had had it open the entire day. It was open because it got so hot earlier on while I was playing on the computer. Despite it being Norway, our summers are usually warm, and I must have just forgotten to close and lock the door before I fell asleep. I sighed in relief as I started to walk towards the door to close it before going back to sleep. As I passed the entrance to the living room, my heart almost jumped out of my chest. Just as I passed the living room, music starts playing loudly from inside it. It was so loud that I was sure the entire town could hear it. I had my PC hooked up to some speakers, but I never had them turn that loud. And how did the music just randomly start on its own at that exact point? It was a woman that sung opera in a high-pitched tone. I had never heard the song before, and I for sure didn't have it on any of my playlists. The title was Secret Garden, and to my surprise, the music wasn't being played from Spotify, but from YouTube. What the fuck? How was that possible? Had someone noticed the open door, snuck their way past my bedroom, opened my PC and decided that it was a good idea to turn on some opera music on YouTube? I didn't understand any of this, but I quickly exited the browser, killing the loud music. I then walked through the long hallway and closed the entrance door. I turned on all the lights and searched every room in the basement, and as I'm sure you're aware, I didn't find anyone or anything. I even looked for footprints in the hallways. It had a white carpet, which shows tracks easily. I don't know how to explain this. I can still remember that sound that woke me up so clearly, like soft chimes from metal on glass. I also figured that it couldn't have been some intruder who entered the apartment and decided to use my PC to play some music from YouTube, because the music started just as I walked by the living room and there was nobody there. And before you comment that someone hacked me or used TeamViewer or something, there's no way. I have worked in IT for 2 years and know my way around a computer. I didn't have any viruses or any software installed to let someone external take control of my computer. And that still wouldn't explain the noise that woke me up, which I know didn't come from my computer. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the paranormal, but this experience made me think about it. I'm not religious, and I would very much say I'm a man of science. I study psychology, and I am aware of the ways our brains can fool us into thinking we hear something or see something that isn't real. But this wasn't like that. The sound that woke me up was so clear, and I was wide awake when I heard those 3 chimes. I don't really know how to explain the music that suddenly started to blast as I walked past the entrance to the living room. I never heard or experienced anything like this after that. My mum constantly complains about the light bulbs dying in the basement, even though she just changed them. This only happens in the basement, and I'm sure there is a logical reason, but I dare you to explain my own experience.
Number 5.
It all started around July of 2016. I was having a sleepover with my friend on a Friday night. We'll call my friend Jay for privacy reasons. Jay had around 15 acres of land, 4 acres of that being a forest. We like to set up our tents in his forest and go camping there sometimes. So we set up our tent under a giant tree. This particular tree had weird dream catchers on it. No one knew how they got there or why they were there, not even his family. It was around 12:30 when we decided to walk up their driveway, so we gathered our flashlights and headed over. Once we got there, we started to walk the driveway, and we got this weird feeling in our stomachs, and it just got stronger and stronger the more we walked. Our flashlights also started to flicker and went out at the end of the driveway, so we decided to just go back to the tent. Once we got back, however, we noticed something a little odd. We put our backpacks back into our tent and decided to walk around the tent. What we found, I'll never forget. There was glass and string on the ground, and when we looked up, there were no dream catchers left. They were on the ground, all crushed. We just assumed it was the wind and went back into the tent. It was now around 2:30 AM, so we decided we should head to bed. As we were falling asleep, we could hear leaves crunching. I assumed it was Jay's dad because he liked to scare us. But when Jay yelled out, "Dad, we know it's you. You can go get a life now," we heard no response. So we thought it was an animal. But as we listened, we could tell that this thing only had 2 legs. The walking continued for an hour and a half, walking around our tent. I looked out when I had had enough, and when I decided to look out the tent window, I could hear footsteps near the door. However, when I peeked out the window, there was nothing there. No trace of anything or anyone. And when I laid back down, there were no sounds. Nothing. The next morning, we went up to Jay's dad, and Jay told him, "Nice try scaring us last night." I then also said, "Why were you even out there for that long?" I paused to see a confused look on Jay's dad's face. I continued, "You were out there for an hour and a half, for crying out loud." When Jay's dad had a chance to speak, he said, "What do you mean? I was sleeping all night. I wouldn't go out for that long." At this point, Jay had a worried look on his face. So did I. Unfortunately, I had to leave his house before we could figure anything out. It was around a month later. Jay and I had forgotten everything that had happened. We were having another sleepover, and at the time, I had a cast on my foot, so we couldn't do much. I was using my crutches instead of my wheelchair because it was too much of a hassle to bring it over. It was a Friday night. Once again, it was 12:30 in the morning. We were bored, and Jay's parents said that we couldn't go outside, but we decided to sneak out anyway. This was a hard task with my crutches and my cast, but somehow we did it without being caught. Again, we started to walk up the driveway. We were talking about stuff normal teens do, but as we walked further down, we got that weird feeling in our stomachs again. When this happened, I immediately remembered what happened the night of the dream catchers. We heard a loud bang from the end of the driveway, so we looked in panic, and we saw what looked like 3 eyes. I felt like I couldn't move. I was just standing there. Jay was yelling at me that we had to go back. Then I realized what had happened and snapped out of it and went back to the house. Nothing else happened that night. We decided to have another sleepover on September 16th of 2016. This was the day that I got my cast off, so it was perfect. Although my muscles were weak, I could barely walk, so I suffered through it. This night, we were prepared for this thing. We set up our tent back in the woods, but this night, nothing really weird happened. It was now October 8th of 2016. Jay, one of Jay's friends who we'll call Will, and I were hanging out together. We did some fun stuff like eat 10 warheads at once. After some fun, and as night was setting in, we were talking and then heard some rattling in his barn. It kind of sounded like a door shutting or something. We went silent before we walked up to the barn, and I got a knife out and ready while Will and Jay followed behind me. His barn was 2 stories high. We were in the top floor earlier in the day, and when we came down, we made sure to close up the door to the stairwell. When we got in, we noticed 2 things. The first thing was that the door to the stairwell was open, and the second was that we heard footsteps on the floor to the upstairs. So I walked into the stairwell and led the way up the stairs, step by step. When we got up there was no one up there. I looked into his yard and I saw something white. I blinked and it moved. I looked one more time, but it was gone. I told them what I saw and we headed that way. By now, Will was begging for us to go back to the house, but we refused. Then Jay yelled out, "Run!" So we ran back. I asked what the hell he saw and he responded with, It was something in a white outfit, glowing white, with 3 eyes. I got a worried look on my face. Will asked what the hell was going on, and we explained everything, and he freaked out and left Jay's house. Now, I wish I could say that this was the end, but it's not. We had a sleepover at my house on October 22nd of 2016. Nothing weird happened that night, but it seemed to have started something. Every night since then, Jay and I have been hearing screaming when our family can't. The latest things that have happened have been destructive. At Jay's house, he saw a white figure near his barn. He blinked and it was gone, and one of his sheep laid on the ground dead. On October 27th of 2016, I was drinking a can of Dr. Pepper and I left to go get something. When I came back, the can was upside down and the pop was spilled all over my desk. Luckily, it didn't go on my computer. I have no idea what's going on.
Number 4.
I live in Canada, near the escarpment, which is a mountainous area full of trees. Beside the escarpment are large fields of farms. My uncle worked at one of these farms. One summer, when I was 9 years old, he took my 3 cousins and me to work with him, with the permission of his employer. We were allowed to play, but we were told not to go towards the sparse forest that went down the land from the mountains to the road. We were also told not to go along the road to the other side of the forest because there was an abandoned barn there, according to my uncle. After this little pep talk, they all set off to work and we played in the cornfields. We were playing hide and seek, but as we played, we slowly crept closer and closer to the forest, and eventually, the game ended up in the forest. By the time we were playing in the forest, it was already late afternoon. Once it was my turn to hide, I ran off far to the end of the forest. I was greeted by a large barn that was a faded red. Its roof had collapsed and it had holes in its walls. Being the smartass I thought I'd hide in the barn, knowing that it would be the perfect hiding spot. In my mind, I was thinking of bragging about being brave and cool as I went to the back of the barn, into a stable and sat in the corner. It had a weird smell, but I ignored it. The smell could be endured for victory's sake. Being narcoleptic, I fall asleep in comfortable environments very easily, and at the time, the barn was very comfortable. When I woke up, it was completely dark. I figured my cousins couldn't find me and had given up. I felt some disappointment that they couldn't find me in my awesome hiding spot. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed that I wasn't alone. Right in front of me, across to the other side of the wall, was a man, just sitting there, staring at me. I remember he looked young but extremely tired. I was frightened because I felt something off about him. I almost even screamed, but nothing came out though. I took deep breaths and mentally prepared myself for anything. I did Taekwondo, so I was confident that I could hurt him enough to run off at least. But all that confidence faded to dust when he stood up. I forgot every single thing that I learned. He staggered a bit, losing his footing as he walked. In the rush of the moment, I started to kick both of my feet against the wall of the barn with all the strength of my legs, and actually broke through. He bolted towards me, and I jumped through the hole, breaking it completely open as I went through quickly. And I ran, and I didn't look back. I ran to the road, and then following the side of the road, I ran along the edge of the forest and straight to the cornfields. I thought he wouldn't be able to find me in the cornfields if he was behind me. I just kept running straight until I saw lights piercing through the cornfields like blinds. I followed it, and I found the farmhouse. The first person I saw was my mother, and I didn't stop running until I ran into her arms. Finally, to safety. It took a moment for me to realize that there were 2 police officers there. When my mother put me down on a chair, she screamed, noticing my injuries, which up until this point, I didn't notice at all. I had a large piece of wood piercing the loose flesh of my leg. I was severely bruised and scraped all over, bleeding profusely. Until it was pointed out, I strangely did not feel any pain at all. But once I did, I started to cry. They told me the ambulance was coming, and the police tried to get me to talk in the meanwhile. And I told him, while stuttering and fighting my tears, I told him I was in an abandoned barn, and there was a man that attacked me. I gave them details of whatever I could remember of the man, and I remembered him very well. The police went to check the barn, and when they came back, they seemed to be shaken and unusually quiet. The 2 policemen just looked at each other, and then called my parents aside to talk to them. They talked for a while. The ambulance finally arrived, and my parents came back to me as they pulled me out to the stretcher. They seemed almost frightened and shocked. I was taken away to the hospital. Once I was released and we went home, my parents never let me bring it up again. Not that I was completely willing to anyway, but it always stuck at the back of my mind. What did they find? Did the man escape? Why did they look so disturbed? A couple of years later, I asked my mother what the police officer had told her back then at the farm. My mother stared at me for a bit, as if she was deciding whether or not she should tell me. She parted her lips for a moment before speaking. The police told us that the man you described was found in the barn, at the back, leaning against the wall. She paused for a while. I simply thought about it during that long moment. The man must have backed off once I escaped. Dead, she blurted out, interrupting my thoughts. I felt my heart sink and my stomach twist. The police said that he must have been dead for at least a couple of weeks. I am now almost 18, and to this day, I don't know what I saw. Was it my imagination, or something else?
Number 3.
This happened to me in a campsite in Kentucky with my dad. We lived in a small town that you could blink and miss. In fact, it wasn't really a town at all. It just had some hollows, which is what we call streets that are nestled in between the mountains. We lived in a family holler called Grim Holler. I know, spooky, right? But it was honestly my grandmother's maiden name. We lived in a trailer, and our closest neighbour, my Uncle Bob, lived about 1.5 miles up the road. My grandmother had lived in Kentucky her whole life, born and raised, and a few years ago died. I moved there when I was 11, from Iowa. I lived there with my dad and her. She only had one leg due to diabetes, so I used to take her wheelchair to be a jerk. But to be honest, even in her old age, she got around just fine without it. But that sure didn't stop her from yelling at me. She was an old gypsy kind of woman, very superstitious. She used to tell me about how, when walking with someone down the street, never to let a pole come between you because it hurts your connection with that person. Even now, as a grown 24-year woman with no religious views, I find myself doing a lot of the stuff that she told me not to do. About a year ago, I came across a creepypasta that chilled me to the bones, something I hadn't put a lot of thought into, even when it happened. I'm sure you know it, the Goat Man. One night, my older cousin was telling me about some of the folklore Grams used to tell him. One of them being about this thing that lived in the woods that would trick you into following it so deep into the woods that you would get lost and never be found. And immediately, Grams gets very, very mad. She went off on a rant about how if you talk about it, it comes, and it's bad luck to even talk about it. Seeing how much this freaks her out, I press on just to mess with her. But I suddenly want to know all about this thing in the woods. Unfortunately though, she went on to never talk about it again, but my cousin told me the rest of the story later that night. A few days pass and I don't think about it a lot. I was more worried about bobcats than a made-up superstition about a goat monster in the woods. The property that we lived on was huge, and my dad had mowed this tall grass area so that we could have a campsite. We're out there, maybe a quarter mile from the trailer, but with how tall the grass was, you couldn't see it or anything around it. It had just gotten dark and we were cooking corn and hot dogs, and my dad went back up to the trailer to grab some buns. I never liked the dark, and with how much wildlife is in Kentucky, I was super pumped about being left there. After a little bit, I was hearing this gritting sound, like what someone makes when they're mumbling under their voice. Then I see the tall grass move just in front of me, but it was so dark that I couldn't see what was causing it. I kept telling myself it was rabbits. They're all over, so it must have been one. That was until the noise was just on the edge of the grass. There was this smell, this awful metal smell. It was like when my dad tossed beer cans into the fire. It was so strong, and the grass was moving more. I noticed something really weird too. It was like mid-August, and I couldn't hear anything other than the grass moving. No wind, no bugs or birds, nothing but the grass rustling. And I saw my dad coming up the little trail. If it wasn't for me being frozen scared, I would have gotten up and hugged him. But immediately, he was mad at me, thinking that I tossed empty cans into the fire, which, being 11 at the time, I wasn't allowed to do. I tried to tell him that it wasn't me and that the smell had come out of nowhere. We were considering camping out there, but Graham said that we shouldn't camp out because the news said it was going to rain. So my dad dumped some water on the fire and we packed up, leaving the little tent. That night, there was a massive thunderstorm. The best thing about Kentucky thunderstorms is that when you're in the holler and surrounded by trees with no streetlights, and it's blackout and the lightning hits, it's like the middle of the day for like a good 2 to 3 seconds. You can only see past the first 2 tree lines depending on how bright the lightning is, but everything past that was still ink black. From my porch to the street that ran in front of my trailer was maybe 10 yards, then the tree line was pressed right against the other side of the road. I was sitting on the porch watching the storm, which I had done a few times before. I was still a little nervous about the grass. When the lightning hits, everything in our front yard to the second tree line is bright as day. And the second time is when I saw it. Standing behind the first tree line, there was something standing in the woods with their back to the house. Then it was pitch black again. I sit there, waiting for it to happen again. And that's when I smell it, that smell again. That awful blood and metal smell. Then the lightning and thunder hits again. Was standing closer to the first set of trees. I was really confused and a little freaked out. Then it hit again. I thought for sure that it was going to be in my yard, just looking at me. But when I quickly scanned the woods, I saw it was gone. So I go into the trailer, not wanting to see where this weird person was going to pop up next. And I'm standing in the doorway in the kitchen where my grandmother is standing at the sink doing dishes. She looks at me and asks me why I'm not out watching the storm. I tell her that there's this weird person standing in the woods with their back to me. She looks at me, and in a split second, with one leg mind you, my Grams rushed to the back door and locks it, then past my dad on the couch and locks the front door. She tells my dad to lock the windows. He grumbles at first, but after a few choice words from Grams, gets up and does what he's told. She then took me into her room and shut the door and made me tell her everything. I tell her about the tall grass and the metal smell and how it came back when I was on the porch. I stayed in her room that night, and when I had to go to school on that Monday in the early morning when it was still dark, she made my dad stand out with me. We didn't camp out after that because the next morning the tent was destroyed. It looked like someone took scissors and ripped holes all over. My dad just chalked it up to the storm, but when my Uncle Bob found the tent zipper in his yard, my dad got a little freaked out. After finally reading up about the Goat Man, I can't tell you how I felt. Like I was so close to this thing. It was lurking in the grass, just a few feet from me. I wish my Grams was still here and I could tell her I believed her and I was sorry for making fun of her. So if you're ever in Whittinsville, Kentucky, please watch out.
Number 2.
I'm a senior in high school, and right now my class schedule is a mix of some AP classes and some easier electives. In my electives, there's usually a collective mix of people from all different grades, so I don't know a lot of the kids in my classes. There's one class in particular that I have with my best friend. The teacher is wonderful, the course load isn't too demanding, and it's an all-around fun class. That is, unless you count the kid I have to sit next to. We'll call this kid Brian. I knew on the first day of class that I did not like Brian. He interjects into class conversation in places where it's not needed, and with some really shitty jokes that he seems to think are hilarious. He's also the type of person who will repeat what he said over and over if he thinks everyone is ignoring him as a sign that they just didn't hear him. Now, you may be thinking that he has some sort of disability, but I can promise you, he doesn't. I'm no expert, but just knowing this kid, I can almost guarantee his only problem is impulse control. I was getting an A, the teacher loved me, and the rest of the kids in the class were actually very witty and intelligent. Nothing could ruin this class for me. But then, things started getting weird. The first incident happened pretty suddenly. Somehow, the topic of Islam came up, and Brian did a complete 180 from the shitty jokes and the unnecessary comments. He went on a rant about how Muslim people were no good psychos who blow up shit, and how they all needed to be eradicated, and a bunch of other insane shit. I was more pissed off than scared, and luckily, the bell rang soon after. I just joked about how idiotic he was for the rest of the day, and the incident was soon at the back of my mind. But that was far from the last time Brian lost it in class. I noticed that Brian had a very explosive temper. He sleeps almost every day in class, which of course is frowned upon. So the first time this happened, the kid behind him woke him up, and Brian flipped his shit. He went absolutely ballistic on the kid behind him, yelling at him, calling him a fag, telling him to suck his dick, yelling at him to go fuck himself, and just in general abusing this poor kid. I've seen some high school boys yell at each other before, of course, but this was so much different. I've never seen someone blow up so easily at such a minor thing before. The more other people in the class began to dislike Brian, the worse he got. One girl in particular, I'll call her Catherine, snaps at him nearly every day. It's the same daily routine. She'll turn around in her seat, insult him, and then turn back to face the front of the class. When she does this, I always have to brace myself to see Brian's face turn into a mask of pure rage and hatred that is truly terrifying to see on somebody so young. Then, after this, he'll begin mumbling things. I've been pretty freaked out by the things that I've heard him mumbling. Over the weeks, he had several more angry outbursts. Someone told him to put it down and pay attention. He yelled louder than I've ever heard him yell before.
I am paying attention.
He continued to scream so loudly that the teacher had to finally get him to calm down, and even he looked disturbed. After he finally stopped yelling, Brian just put both hands to his head, closing his eyes, squeezing inward and hissing, "Shut up," over and over again. And I do mean hissing. It sounded so malicious that I had to look away. My concern spiked when we had to do a group assignment. We formed a group of 8 people based on how close together we were in the room, and Brian was in our group. After we finished the assignment, we got off track, talking about where we planned to go after we finished high school. My friend and I, being the only two seniors in the group, we were really the only ones who had any sort of idea. My friend shared that she planned to go into the military after graduation because she had no other way to pay for college. Brian spoke up and said, word for word,
I want to go in the military because I want to know what it's like to kill people.
We were all pretty taken aback by this. If he had said it some other way, we may have laughed it off, but he was dead serious. There was no inflection in his voice. It was just flat, like he was telling us he had a bagel for breakfast or something else mundane like that. I quickly interjected and told him that even if he does go into the military, he's unlikely to ever kill someone. He actually looked pissed at this. Like, really pissed. Needless to say, I've never seen someone look angry at the prospect of not killing people, and I sure as shit don't want to see it again. My friend and I began to joke about how he was likely to become a school shooter one day, and how we hoped he waited until we graduated. But our jokes were an attempt to cover up the genuine concern that we both had. Every time he stood up, or asked to go to the bathroom, or reached into his backpack, we both flinched. Last week, Brian didn't show up for class. We thought he was absent, but word travels fast in high school. We soon learned that he was suspended and could possibly have criminal charges pressed against him. We didn't know why, so I took it upon myself to ask a few people in his grade what he had done. I suspected that he got into a fight or sassed a teacher, but the real reason had me in near hysterics. He really had threatened to shoot up the school, beginning with his first class, my class.
Number 1.
Ever since I was a child, I've seen and experienced things that have defied rational explanation. I consider myself a skeptic, and for the sake of conversation, often describe myself as a spiritual atheist. What I mean by this is, I don't believe in any sort of creator, supreme being, intelligent design, or anything like that. I don't scoff at those who do believe in these things. I just personally have never experienced anything in my life that I could attribute to the actions of a higher power. That being said, I do believe in some sort of spiritual form of thermodynamics. Much past that, I don't know what I do or don't believe. One of my earliest memories as a child, I'm roughly 5 years old, living in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. I'm in my father's office waiting for him to finish briefing his
Number 7.
So I recently started school again, and as a part of my daily regime, I'm required to travel to Toronto, Monday to Friday, via the train and subway lines. It's about a good 2 hours one way, so I usually pull out a good book, pop in my headphones and relax to some light music. I, of course, being from out of town, have heard a lot of horror stories that many people endure on the TTC. Naturally, I thought most of it was just over-exaggeration and tall tales. Well, I was very quickly proven dead wrong. Rewind to a week ago. I had just finished a very long grueling day of school, 5 AM to 7 PM, and I wanted nothing more than just to relax and get home ASAP. I took my usual bus route to the subway station and sat down on one of the seats directly next to an exit door. Now, a little context. I am facing forwards, looking at one seat ahead of me across the aisle of the subway car. This seat was occupied by a 20-something Asian lady who was playing some game on her phone and was paying absolutely no attention to anything going on around her. And it's the person in this seat that made my 40-minute subway ride very disturbing. Occupying the seat was a lady, about 30-40 years of age, who possessed a very creepy smile. I say this because she never stopped smiling. And I mean that she was smiling the entire subway ride. Anyways, the car pulled out of the station and we were on our way. For the first half of the trip, she would continuously be staring at this Asian girl, laughing and muttering to herself. She would also take her phone out of her purse and start taking pictures of this girl and whatever was on her phone. How she didn't see this, I have no clue. About halfway up the tracks, the Asian lady left the car, and this is when the attention was directed to me.
She turned full front to me and just smiled at me with a huge toothy grin. I knew deep down that if I made eye contact, I was going to be in for a bad time. So I just stared at a poster on the roof of the train for what felt like hours. Eventually she got the hint that I was avoiding her gaze like the plague, and she went to plan B. She opened her purse and removed a tube of toothpaste and proceeded to ingest roughly half of the tube. I damn near threw up then and there, but somehow held it together, even though she was still staring and laughing at me covered in toothpaste. My stop came and I bolted from that car as fast as I could. I got to the escalator and hazarded a glance back, and guess who I see fast walking after me, arms at her side, still smiling. I was understandably pants-shittingly terrified by this point. I ran out of the station right to the bus just as it was pulling out of the station. I took one final look back and there she was, standing on the platform, head cocked to the side, laughing and waving by.
Number 6.
Now, I was 15 or 16 at the time. I had just finished my exams, so me and my friends were all bored with nothing to do in the summer months. We lived in a small village, not totally enclosed by wilderness and forest, but we were still in an isolated village with fields and meadows all around. My friend Dylan, the most adventurous in the group apart from me, said that we should go explore for the day. At the time, we thought, why not? The days were long and the nights fairly light until 11ish o'clock. We all agreed to go out. We took water, food, and a few other things, including me taking a penknife. I always took one with me. So a group of 6 or 7 of us set out in the late afternoon. The day was a really nice day, so we ambled up through the fields and small woods for a few hours, laughing at each other's jokes and funny stories. We did this until around 6ish. The sun wasn't fading, but it began to get slightly darker. We stumbled out of the small woods that we were walking through. We guessed that we were roughly 2 to 3 miles away from the center of our village. We came to a small abandoned mill. We all had knowledge of its existence, but we had never been in. When we initially discovered it, it was winter, and our parents had told us not to go in it. This was because homeless people might have been in there, but being fueled with adventure, we decided to go over and explore. We had seen videos on YouTube of people exploring abandoned buildings and they never came to any harm, right? So we made our way over there and we were greeted with a very spooky looking building. It wasn't boarded up, but the interior was extremely dark, so we all pulled out our phones and turned our lights on. We all mustered up some courage, saying that we'd beat the shit out of any homeless people, but we all knew deep down that we'd run the fuck out of there. Those who had knives pulled them to give us some courage. We stepped inside and saw the usual. Litter was everywhere and graffiti on the walls, with the stereotypical get out and turn back. We pressed on into the main room of the mill, with stairs to our right going down into the basement and up to the top floor. We explored the main room for a bit, and we moved upstairs to find a place which looked like a homeless person had been staying in, but it was long abandoned. Finally, we all decided that we should go into the basement. We had all been postponing it. We had seen enough horror movies to know that it was the scariest part. We all held each other pretty close, a kind of brotherly comfort. We all stepped down into the basement and we were met with a terrifyingly dark corridor. We shone our lights into the darkness and we saw just a shortish corridor, our torch beams only just illuminating the end of the passage. It was bare concrete with a horrible smell emanating from the end of the passage. At the end was a dark green iron door with the paint peeling off and rust coating the hinges. We gingerly stepped forward, Dylan taking the lead. Dylan was followed by me and my friend Harry, and we became increasingly aware of the disgusting stench coming from the door. We stepped up to the door and I tried to wrench it open, but the rusted hinges screeched in defiance and refused to budge. Finally, it took 4 of us to heave the door open. When it opened, the stench hit us like a brick wall. Harry almost instantly keeled over and began wrenching. We poked our torches into the blackness and what we saw shocked us. The remains of a dog lay in the middle of the room. It had been absolutely savaged. It was mangled, its bare ribs showing, thousands of flies covering the remains, legs detached from the body. We were terrified and felt sick. We went to push the door closed to try and stop the stench from coming through the doorway, but as we tried to shut it, a piercing, almost inhuman scream erupted from the room. I moved back from the door and, with a rush of adrenaline, kicked the door as hard as I could. The metal screamed in protest and scraped across the floor. We began sprinting out of the mill, and as fast as we could, we burst out of the entrance and continued running until we were far away from that building. We all decided to go home after that, taking the back roads. We never went back there, and every day I think about what would have happened if we had gone in, or would we have seen whatever made that scream. It really does haunt me.
Number 5.
I've told this story to my roommates who are from the same town, and I've talked about it a few times with some of the people who were there, but that's it. I don't like to talk about it, because inevitably someone will say, "Really, we should go and try and find it again," and I really don't want to. I've looked for it on a map a few times, but I can't find it. Though, my male friend who drove there that night swears he has the directions memorized. Anyway, I'm originally from a major city in southern Ohio, and outside of town there are a number of smaller townships. One of these is known as the more country bumpkin, redneck, grit part of town. It's not even in the same county, but it's part of the general area my city is in though. In the woods, there's this legend of Hell's Church, supposedly an old church that burned down where Satanists do rituals now, or a Satanist church that burned down by a ritual, depending on who you ask. There are a number of Hell's Church myths in Ohio in many different places, but this one was the closest to us, and a number of my guy friends decided that they wanted to be ghost hunters and check out haunted places where we lived. We were juniors in high school, and while all of us obviously thought that this was just stupid bullshit, we thought it would be funny to go out and scare ourselves. Plus, most people had cars or driver's licenses by now, so we were enjoying a new burst of freedom. I'm a scaredy cat about most stuff like this, but I was the most tomboyish girl in the group and always kind of wanted to be able to hang out with the guys. Plus, some of the girls in the group who I was closer to were going, so I didn't want to look like a loser or a pussy. So one day in November, we decide we're going to go out one night and try and find this church. We had actually been to this location once before that fall, but one of my friends had a curfew, so after exploring an old barn and the railroad tracks on a bridge nearby, we left. We hadn't found the church, to our disappointment and my mild relief. We took 2 cars out there, going past more populous parts of our city and back to this woody-ish area. I can't honestly tell you how we got there, but I know it's off a state highway, then an abandoned access road, past some old warehouse and then down a dirt road. Once you get down the dirt road, there's a kind of thicker part of the road early on where we parked our cars. We did this because the road thins out and becomes impossible to drive down. And also, someone clearly owns this land and later down the road there is some no trespassing signage. I'm sure a ton of kids come back here, so it didn't seem odd to me that they wanted to block this place off. I barely thought twice about it at the time. We get out of our cars and start walking down the dirt road, wandering off the path from time to time to check out barns or clearings where we thought the chimney might be. At first, it was scary because it was dark and old or whatever. But then the barns started to get weirder. Like they were filled with weird spray painting symbols and bullshit. But that's not what bothered us. We figured whoever was there before us did it, which I still 100% believe. But there was also other stuff, like dead owls that looked like they'd been opened up, though they were dried out and decomposed by the time we got there, thank God. And other bits that looked like they might have come from animals. I was grossed out, but we all kind of agreed that these probably came from some teenagers trying to fake a satanic ritual, or that the animals got trapped in the falling apart barn and died in there to be picked apart by other animals. My friends are now hardcore trying to find this stupid chimney, so they keep taking off through the trees into the clearings. Myself and the other 2 girls who were there kind of hang back on the tree line for most of them, getting a little more nervous and a little irritated with all the coming up empty. As we keep going, we find a bike on the tree line, like a bike that maybe a 12-year-old would ride. That's a little creepy, but fine, whatever. Probably belonged to someone who owned the land. We decide we're going to go a little further, and soon enough, we find another bike. This one is older, a little rusted but still undersized. We didn't talk too much about the other bike, just kind of mumbling that it's probably still nothing. One or two of the 4 guys who were there are kind of trying to pump it up, saying, "These kids probably got murdered, you know," and other stuff like that, but no one's really having it. By this point, we've been there for about 2 hours and it's getting really late. Plus, I think we're all a little more creeped out than we all wanted to admit. We decided to head back to the cars and I'm feeling relieved, happy to be headed back to my house and the fuck out of here. But things never work out that way, do they? By the cars, we see a road that goes straight up a hill through the trees. At the start of it, there's a big metal gate that had a road closed sign on it, which we had seen before, but for some reason it had never occurred to us to try and go up that road. We had a small debate at the gate, about an evenish split on who wanted to venture up and who didn't. I absolutely didn't. But eventually we decided that we'll go up, just to see. Both of the drivers want to go, so there's not a lot we can do about it. We climb over the gate and start up the hill, where an old pavement road is cracked and crumbled under our feet, though it was for sure a real asphalt road at some point. In addition to the road's condition and the brush being an obstacle, someone had felled a bunch of trees over the path, purposely blocking off the road from any cars. Some of us are starting to seriously question if we should be doing this, arguing that somebody obviously wanted to keep us out of here, but we get teased for being afraid and keep going. I couldn't see where the road would end because it was so dark, and the trees made it even harder to see. Plus, the road was super steep, so all you could really see was up, with a little moonlight peeking through the trees. All of a sudden though, we reach the end. The trees just open up and we've come off an incline to a flat field, and holy fuck, what a sight it was. It's a flat field with tall prairie grass on either side, probably 2 to 3 feet high and pretty uniform. The path we're on splits the large clearing we're in down the center and leads through the grass to a cul-de-sac with 3 buildings. 2 look like they are farmhouses, with 1 barnish building. They were wooden, while they may have been painted at one point. It looked like they'd been mostly weathered and stripped by time. I see this, and I'm done. I want to leave. But of course, some of my friends say that we have to check out these buildings. At this point, I finally put down my foot, as do the other 2 girls and one of our guy friends. We all decided that this is enough. So the 3 guys who want to go to the buildings tell us to just wait there. And while we don't want to be in this field, out in the open, we decided we can't just leave them. At this point, we've turned off our flashlights because the moonlight is so strong. The 3 of them take off down the little path and the 4 of us who remain stand together, bitching about how stupid our friends are and making small talk. None of us say it, but we're all looking to the grass every now and again, worried that something is going to jump out. It's just so creepy, this abandoned little settlement. It feels like our friends are gone forever, but we finally see them get to a building and go inside. We can see the flicker of their flashlights in the windows, and I just remember feeling so tense. It was like watching a horror movie in real life. After maybe 10 minutes, though it could have been just a tense 5, we see our guy friends coming towards us, lightly jogging, looking afraid for the first time all night. "You idiots went inside?" I said, pissed off at them. One of my friends just looked at us and I'll never forget it. It was full of bikes, just bikes chained to the walls. We didn't believe them and kept waiting for them to say that they were kidding, but they insisted and said it was like they were just storing a bunch of bikes there, most of them smaller. They looked afraid, and as much as I didn't want to believe them, I did. They aren't the type of guys to pull a prank for this long. By then, we all agree that we need to get the fuck out of there. We start down the hill, hurrying the best we can. All of a sudden, about halfway down the field, we can see our car's headlights down the hill, about where our cars are. We see them pass slowly and we know someone is down there looking for us. Because it's so far off the beaten path, we figure that it's one of 2 things. 1, the cops and we're going to be fucked for trespassing. Or 2, the people who own this land or these houses or something, and they're going to A, call the cops, or B, murder us. We know that the road isn't that long, so they'll be turning around, circling back soon enough, and because our cars are there, they'll probably wait for us. We're all whispering about this as we pick up the pace, sprinting down the hill as fast as we can. I'm not a good runner, but I was hauling ass, getting down as fast as I could, basically hurdling over the fallen trees. Once we get down the hill, we don't see any headlights, but we know that they can't be far away. "Get in the fucking cars!" One of our friends yells, and we're fumbling with the doors like a horror movie, just too nervous to get into the cars. We get in, and just as we start the cars up, we see the headlights speeding down the road. A giant black truck roaring up behind us. The truck seemed larger than life, raced up off the ground. The whole thing was terrifying, but what was even more terrifying was the fact that we couldn't see who was driving in the dark with the headlights blinding us. We peel out of there, total pedal to the metal. This truck is still following us, bearing down on us as our two cars race out of there. The truck is also getting real close to us, threateningly close, almost like it was trying to run us off the road. We're all screaming, looking back at the truck, fighting for some distance. Once we get to the highway, we switch lanes, trying to escape. Luckily, we were in sedans, so it was easier for us to weave in and out of cars. But this truck is still chasing us. We're in two different lanes, but we don't want to get too separated from our friends. The passengers of both cars are texting back and forth, trying to make a plan. It took about 15 minutes to lose the truck. I'm not sure if the distance was too much or if they just turned around, but once we got to a big shopping centre, we ducked off the road and into a Sonic parking lot. We all sat in our cars for a little bit, watching to make sure that we weren't going to get snuck up on, before getting out of the car to get some food and talk. Everyone, even the guys who had tried to act tough the whole time, was pretty shaken up. It took a while to settle down enough to head home. As much as we talked it over, we just couldn't figure out what had happened. Eventually we all went home, during what was a pretty silent car ride. We didn't talk about it again for a long time. We never called the police, which, honestly, as an adult now, I feel like we should have. I don't think about it often, only during the fall really. But when I do think about it, I ask myself, who chased us? Why was that town abandoned? Who owned those bikes? And where are they now?
Number 4.
It all started nearly a decade ago. I was a happy-go-lucky 10-year-old boy. One day, while at my best friend Sean's house, while his parents and mine went shopping for an upcoming camping trip, he and I were playing outside in his front yard. Living in a small town with a population of about 3,000, we never expected to encounter anything strange. Usually, the strangest thing we ever heard about in this town is people playing their music too loud. Anyway, a man in a dark green Camaro drove up to my friend's house. I had never seen him around town. With my father being the local mechanic, I had seen just about everybody in town at least once. He stopped right in front of the driveway and asked,
"Hey kids, do either of you want to take a ride in my car?"
I had a bad feeling about the whole situation. Before Sean could say a single word, I replied for both of us. No thanks." Grabbing his shirt, I forcefully dragged him back inside his house. "What the hell was that about?" Sean yelled at me. I thought I had done good by preventing him from doing something stupid that could get us both hurt or in trouble. He means well, but he doesn't always use his common sense, even to this day. We calmed down and watched some pointless cartoons until our parents returned from the store. About 30 minutes later, our parents arrived and we left town for the weekend. I never mentioned what happened with the guy, but now I regret it. We drove for a few hours until we arrived at a large lake. We didn't have the chance to do much the first day other than set up camp and eat dinner.